Robin Brooks was born on March 30th, 1960, in the state of Virginia. In her childhood, she moved with her family to the small town of Highland, located in the state of New York. Robin was a cheerful and sociable person, had many friends, and always knew how to find common ground with people. She also had an older sister, Mariah, with whom she was very close. After school, Robin decided to move to California. In addition to the state's climate attracting her, the young woman had another weighty reason to move. Shortly before that, her sister also went there, and Robin decided to follow her. The young woman rented in an apartment in the city of Sacramento and got a job there. Several months later, she had the opportunity to move to a residential complex where her sister lived with her boyfriend. In addition to the fact that the apartments were very significantly better, Robin could spend more time with Mariah, and shortly before her 20th birthday, she decided to move. The young woman rented a separate apartment, and in order to pay the rent, she had to take 2 jobs. One of them was a cashier position at a donut shop located just a few meters from her residential complex. Robin chose the evening shift to combine it with her second job. The young woman lived in this complex for about 1.5 months, and during this time, managed to make many friends both at work and beyond. She was also glad to have the opportunity to see her sister every day again. On April 24th, 1980, Robin was supposed to start her shift at the donut shop at 4 p.m. But to the surprise of her colleagues, she never showed up. This was very strange because during her time working there, she never missed her shifts and usually came even earlier than scheduled. The employees waited for several hours, and eventually, one of them decided to go to Robin's apartment. The colleague knocked on the door, but there was only silence in response. After several unsuccessful attempts, he returned to the store and told them that the young woman was not responding. Colleagues were deeply concerned about this fact, assuming that something may have happened to Robin. Otherwise, she would have called to report why she couldn't come to work. During the short time she spent in their store, she had become friends with all the employees, and they were genuinely worried about her. Colleagues considered calling the police, but quickly realized that law enforcement wouldn't search for Robin because of missing a work shift. Then one of them suggested a non-standard solution. He offered to open the entrance door to her apartment to check if everything was okay with her. He and other colleagues headed to her home. Colleagues knocked on the door for a few minutes and ultimately decided to break in. When they were successful, a shocking scene unfolded before them. Robin was lying on her waterbed in the living room, and everything around her was covered in blood. Colleagues immediately called the police, and arriving officers confirmed that the young woman was dead. Her body had numerous stab wounds, apparently inflicted by an unknown assailant who attacked her with a knife and punctured the water mattress several times, causing its contents to spill onto the floor. After examining the crime scene, the police established that the entrance door had no signs of a break-in until Robin's colleagues opened it. The back door was also locked from the inside, leading them to believe that the killer entered the apartment through a window. Soon, forensic experts found evidence of this theory by discovering fingerprints on the windowsill. Medical examiners determined that the victim had been sexually assaulted and obtained the perpetrator's biological material. The apartment also contained small traces of blood that did not match Robin's blood type. Detectives concluded that the killer had cut himself during the attack, and the blood samples were sent to a laboratory. Unfortunately, DNA analysis was not available in the 1980s, so they could not use this evidence. Investigators began interviewing acquaintances of the victim, starting with her colleagues. They said that the young woman had finished her shift at midnight the day before and went home. She was in a good mood, joking around, and generally behaved as usual. Nothing indicated trouble at that moment. Her colleagues added an interesting fact. That day, Robin mentioned that she had washed her bedding before going to work and was worried if it would dry before she returned. The bed in the victim's apartment was not made, leading detectives to conclude that the killer attacked her shortly after she returned home. Her sister also reported something troubling. A few days before her death, Robin mentioned that she was being followed by a man. She did not provide any details about this person that could help identify him, but she said he had come to her store several times and behaved strangely, trying to win her affection. However, he had not done anything to make Robin fear for her safety, so she did not take it seriously. The police were unable to identify this person because they had no characteristics to go on. They continued their investigation, talked to the victim's neighbors, but they did not have any leads. None of them heard any screams or sounds of struggle that night. The neighbors also did not see anyone unfamiliar visiting the victim. In addition, investigators learned that Robin did not go straight home from work that night. She went to a party with her friends for a while and left soon after. According to her acquaintances, she went home alone, and there were no conflicts or strange situations at the party. The police talked to everyone who was there and concluded that they were probably not involved in her murder. Ultimately, the detectives hit a dead end. They had no potential suspects. Robin got along well with her neighbors and colleagues. She had no boyfriend, and there were no people from her past who might have wished her harm. Blood and biological materials at the time could not lead them to the killer, and fingerprint matching against existing databases yielded no results. Investigators believe that the murderer was the persistent visitor to the store that Robin had mentioned. According to their theory, the man followed the victim from work to her home, learning her exact address. The next day, he broke into her apartment through a window while she was at the store and waited. When Robin came home, he attacked her, subjected her to violence, and killed her, then fled. Despite the complete lack of evidence, the investigation continued for some time until it ultimately stalled. It was only in 2004, 24 years after the murder, that the investigation was reopened. By that time, DNA analysis had become a widely used technology, and detectives hoped it would help them identify the killer. They sent blood and biological material to a laboratory where experts extracted a DNA profile and loaded it into the FBI database, but no matches were found. This meant that the killer had not been previously convicted of a serious crime, or that it happened before DNA collection was mandatory for such offenders. Despite this, a troubling discovery awaited investigators in the California State Database. The DNA profile of the killer matched another crime that occurred 3 weeks before Robin's death. At that time, an unknown man had entered another young woman's home, assaulted her, and fled, leaving the victim alive. It all happened at night, and the young woman did not see the attacker's face. She immediately called the police, and forensic experts were able to extract biological material from the man. Detectives tried to find new leads in this case to finally identify Robin's killer, but all of their attempts led them nowhere. Eventually, the case went cold again, and investigators were left periodically checking the DNA profile against databases in case the killer came into police view and his DNA was added there. This continued until 2017, when detectives heard about a new method called DNA phenotyping. Its essence is that genetics experts study a DNA sample and create an approximate portrait of the suspect based on their interpretation of the data obtained. This method is not precise and rather serves as an auxiliary guideline for police. With the help of such a portrait, investigators can look closely at similar suspects or exclude someone from the list. Detectives turned to Parabon Nanolabs, which conducted such research, and soon they prepared an approximate portrait of the killer. He turned out to be a man of African descent, but investigators could not find anyone similar among all the people who even remotely appeared in the case. Parabon Nanolabs prepared two portraits. One showed what the suspect might have looked like in 1980, and the other in 2017. Both images were posted in the media, hoping to get new leads. Relatives of Robin also had hope of finally finding out the truth, so they decided to offer a reward of $10,000 for any information about this person that would help find him. The police received several tips, but they all led nowhere. The identity of the real criminal remained a mystery to them. Despite this, investigators and Robin's relatives were not going to give up. In 2020, this case became one of the unsolved murders for which additional funding was allocated. By that time, a new DNA analysis tool was actively being used, which allowed even distant relatives of the DNA sample owner to be found. For this, at least one person related to him by kinship had to be in public or state DNA databases. The Robin killer sample was handed over to experts from Parabon Nanolabs, and they waited. It took them several months to study all possible relatives of this criminal, trace their genealogies, and finally find a suitable suspect. As a result, the detectives finally got a name: 71-year-old Philip Wilson. But the research results did not confirm his guilt. The police needed to take his DNA and compare it with the sample found in the victim's apartment. They learned the address of this man and began to monitor him. Considering that by law a person is not required to provide their DNA sample, the police have to resort to some tricks. They often try to get some item that the suspect has come into contact with. It can be a water bottle, a cigarette butt, and so on. Having obtained what they needed, investigators hand it over to experts who can extract a DNA sample. In Wilson's case, detectives also did the same. After obtaining an item with his DNA, they sent it to the laboratory. Experts found a complete match. 4 decades later, they finally found the probable killer, and on February 24th of the same year, he was arrested. The man denied his involvement in the murder, but the evidence spoke against him. The police also took his fingerprints, which matched those found on the victim's windowsill. Studying his biography, the detectives learned a lot of interesting facts. At the time of Robin's murder, the man was 31 years old and lived just a few streets from her complex. In addition, Wilson was a regular visitor to the donut shop where the victim worked. This confirmed the police's early theory that the killer was the same unknown stalker who bothered the young woman at work. The man had no serious criminal history, which explained the absence of his DNA and fingerprints in the databases. After his arrest, preparations for the trial began, which dragged on for several years. The process only began in 2022, and by that time, Wilson and his lawyers had prepared a new defense line. According to it, on that night, there was a consensual relationship between Philip and Robin, after which the man went home and someone else broke into the young woman's apartment and killed her. As for the suspect's blood found at the crime scene, his lawyer insisted that Wilson injured himself at work and the wound opened up when he was at Robin's home. The prosecution considered this version of events absurd. First of all, the victim was not in a romantic relationship with anyone. Moreover, she complained about a strange man who was stalking her at work, and that man was likely Wilson. The young woman was annoyed by his behavior and persistence and there was no sympathy between them. Secondly, no other men's DNA traces were found in the victim's apartment. It would be strange to assume that Wilson left his biological material, blood, and fingerprint, while the killer left absolutely nothing. In addition, if we believe the suspect's lawyer, the young woman contacted him of her own free will. But before that, for some reason, she did not make the bed, which had no bedding. Wilson's defense also tried to point to another suspect who could have been the killer. It was Maria's ex-boyfriend, with whom she was living at the time. At the time of the trial, the man was no longer alive, and the lawyer used this fact. He tried to convince the jurors that the man was aggressive, threatened Robin and her sister, and also broke into the victim's apartment. However, nothing could be confirmed, so all these statements did not have a significant impact on the judicial process. As a result, Philip Wilson was found guilty of murder. His sentence was announced on his birthday. The man received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Currently, he is experiencing many health problems, so his time in prison is unlikely to be long. The victim's relatives thanked the detectives for finally bringing the case to a close. Her sister admitted that she still feels guilty. After all, Robin moved to California following her. As for the young woman who Wilson assaulted 3 weeks before the murder, the statute of limitations had expired for that crime, so the man did not receive any additional punishment for it. However, detectives still wonder, did Wilson have other victims? Usually, criminals who commit such horrific acts with a few weeks in between do not stop and continue to harm people. It's possible that Wilson did not plan to kill Robin. He broke into her apartment and assaulted her, but she saw and recognized his face because he had come to her store repeatedly. Fearing a prison sentence, the man may have decided to commit murder and then refrain from committing other crimes. Janna Berry was born on October 26, 1983, in the small American town of Bristol, Tennessee. She was lively and sociable, had many friends, and was always the life of the party. During her school years, she was also part of the local cheerleading team. After high school, Janna enrolled at East Tennessee State University, where she studied psychology and criminalistics. While studying, she also worked part-time at a children's educational center. During her time at university, she met a guy named Jason White. They dated for several years, and shortly before graduation, they got engaged. In late 2004, when Janna was 21 years old, she decided to pursue a master's degree in psychology, which required her to temporarily move to Knoxville to study at a different university. After working at the Children's Center, she realized her passion for this field and aspired to become a child psychologist. Meanwhile, her boyfriend continued his studies in another state, aiming to obtain a law degree. Despite the distance, the couple communicated every day and started preparing for their wedding, which was only a few months away. In Knoxville, Janna planned to find her own accommodation, but for the first few weeks, she stayed at her friend Jason Amami's apartment. He had studied with her and her boyfriend at the university, and after graduating, he moved to Knoxville. He lived in a 2-bedroom apartment and agreed to host his friend until she found a place of her own. Janna found 2 part-time jobs at a jewelry store and a children's hospital. On the evening of December 5th, after finishing her shift at the store, she went to the shopping center to buy Christmas presents. When she returned home, she packed some gifts intended for the children at the educational center, chatted with her apartment neighbor, and went to her room. There, she talked to her boyfriend on the phone and went to sleep. Around 4 a.m., Jason Amami woke up to a woman's scream. He thought Janna had a nightmare and headed to her room. At that moment, a man emerged from the room, and Jason noticed a knife in his hand. The assailant immediately attacked him and delivered several blows. The young man tried to defend himself and at some point managed to fend off the attacker, pushing him away, and ran out of the apartment. Jason quickly ran to the neighboring residential complex and began knocking on every door, hoping that someone would call the police, but no one opened for him. He then sprinted to the nearest 24-hour store, which was almost a kilometer away. Upon seeing the bloodied man, the store clerk immediately called 911, and Jason recounted what happened. The police arrived at his home and immediately discovered Janna lying on the floor next to the corridor door that connected 5 apartments. The young woman was alive, but barely responsive to what was happening around her. As the paramedics prepared to load her into the ambulance, a police officer asked, "Is the attacker still in the apartment?" And he thought he saw Janna nod ever so slightly. The officers thoroughly searched the entire building and the surrounding area, but failed to find him. The young woman was swiftly transported to the nearest hospital, but despite the efforts of the doctors, they were unable to save her. Medical experts determined that she had sustained over 20 knife wounds, leaving the doctors with virtually no chance of saving her life. As for her neighbor, the assailant had managed to inflict 8 wounds on him, with only 1 being serious. The medics provided him with the necessary care, and his life was not in danger. Meanwhile, detectives began investigating the crime scene. From the bloodstains in the corridor, they deduced that the young woman had attempted to reach out to her neighbors and seek help, but none of the 4 residents had opened their doors. Next to the door to Janna's room, investigators found the murder weapon, a kitchen knife belonging to Jason. The assailant had struck with such force that the blade had bent. In addition, the police discovered blood traces near the back door of the apartment and on the staircase leading from the 2nd floor to the street. Considering that Jason and Janna had exited through the front door, the detectives made the most obvious conclusion: the murderer had left the crime scene through the back door. Another lead awaited them in Jason's room. They found a partial footprint, which the perpetrator may have left when following the apartment owner and launching the attack. Considering the brutality with which the killer had dealt with the young woman, the police suspected that the crime was personal in nature. Their first step was to closely scrutinize Janna's fiancé, despite him being approximately 1,000 kilometers away from Knoxville. All friends and relatives attested to the couple having a wonderful relationship, and there seemed to be no motive for the fiancé to commit such a heinous crime. The young man only learned about his fiancé's death at 10 a.m. when her mother called him. He said that after hearing the news, he fainted and took a long time to recover. He had to ask his neighbor to book a plane ticket for him and pack his suitcase since he was incapable of doing anything himself. Detectives thoroughly examined his alibi and concluded that he physically couldn't have traveled to Knoxville and returned by morning. As a result, he was eliminated as a suspect, and the investigators turned their attention to Jonah's neighbor. Unlike the victim's fiancé, the neighbor had no alibi. Jason was in the same apartment as her and could have committed the crime. Friends and relatives of Jonah were also suspicious of him, with some considering him the most likely killer. Others accused him of fleeing the apartment and leaving the young woman alone, leading the victim's parents to not even want him to attend her funeral. Immediately after Jason was discharged from the hospital, the detectives began interrogating him. The young man stuck to his initial version of events. He woke up to a scream, saw an unknown man, and was attacked when he managed to push the assailant away. Jason rushed to the front door and ran outside, attempting to reach the neighbors. He believed that Janna had also managed to leave the apartment since he no longer heard her screams. However, the police were hesitant to believe this account. The first thing that made them suspect Jason was his injuries. 7 out of the 8 wounds proved to be non-life-threatening, and the last one on his right hand could have been sustained during both defense and attack. Furthermore, forensic experts found no signs of forced entry in the apartment, indicating that the perpetrator was already inside. Jason himself mentioned that he had taken out the trash through the back door that evening, but couldn't remember if he had locked it or not. Detectives continued to press him, paying particular attention to the door he used to run out onto the street. Jason insisted that it was the front door, but the police suspected he was lying. If he had exited through the back door, it would explain the bloody traces near the door on the stairs. In that case, it would further implicate him. Additionally, the police accused him of using and selling illicit substances and behaving aggressively when unable to obtain a dose. Jason denied all of these allegations, but the investigators kept bombarding him with various accusations. After spending several hours with Jason at the police station, the detectives offered him a polygraph test, and he agreed. They brought in an expert who asked leading questions, and at the end of the interview, informed him that the polygraph indicated that he had given false answers. Upon hearing this, Jason entered a state of close to hysteria. He screamed that he had nothing to do with the crime and feared for his life, as the real perpetrator was still at large. However, the detectives didn't believe him. Nevertheless, they couldn't arrest him for murder since there was no evidence against Jason. They had to wait for the laboratory experts to finish examining the few pieces of evidence found in the apartment. Then, an unexpected turn of events occurred. On the knife used as the murder weapon, 3 DNA samples were found, those of the deceased young woman, Jason, and an unknown male. The unknown male's DNA was also discovered in Jonah's room, on the back door handle, and on the staircase used by the perpetrator to flee. Furthermore, a fingerprint left by the victim's blood was found on the knife handle, and it didn't match Jason's fingerprint. These discoveries made the police doubt that he was the killer. The evidence confirmed that someone else was indeed present in the apartment that night, but comparing the DNA samples to existing databases yielded no results. Despite the detectives no longer considering Jason as the murderer, public opinion remained against him. He was accused of fleeing and abandoning his girlfriend instead of trying to protect her. In addition to that, Jason began to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. Soon, another interesting fact emerged. It turned out that the polygraph operator had simply misinterpreted the instrument's readings. In reality, there were no signs indicating that Jason was lying. Furthermore, the police had no actual evidence linking the young man to illicit substances. They accused him of it solely to exert additional pressure. Most importantly, the police initially downplayed the severity of the injuries Jason sustained. In reality, he had suffered serious harm, with his lung and neck being severely damaged. Full recovery was unlikely. Due to these police reports, the insurance company only covered 25% of the medical expenses, and Jason experienced significant financial difficulties. After he ceased being a suspect, the police began questioning Jason as a witness. Based on his statements, they created an approximate profile of the attacker. The situation was complicated by the fact that Jason couldn't clearly see the assailant's face, as the room was dark, and the perpetrator immediately attacked him when he exited the room. Detectives also discovered something interesting in Jonah's room: a cap, and near the back staircase, there were scattered discs and a stereo player. Initially, they assumed these items belonged to the victim or Jason, but Jason denied it. According to him, none of those belongings were in his apartment, implying that the killer left them behind. The investigators handed the approximate portrait of the suspect to journalists, and after its publication in the news, the police received hundreds of potential leads. People provided information about acquaintances who even remotely resembled the portrait, and the detectives followed up on each lead. One of them seemed particularly intriguing to a detective. They were informed that in the vicinity of Jonah's murder, there was a group of teenagers known for breaking into houses to commit theft. One of them, a 19-year-old named Michael Perkefell, resembled the suspect's portrait, and the police began searching for him. It wasn't easy since the young man was already wanted for theft. However, now that he was suspected of potential involvement in the murder, dozens of police officers joined the search. They eventually located him and brought him to the station. The investigators immediately noticed his footwear. The pattern on the soles resembled the footprint left by the killer. They collected a DNA sample and fingerprints from him and sent everything to the experts. Meanwhile, they interrogated him, and during the questioning, the detectives were in for an unexpected surprise. Michael confessed almost immediately that he and his friend had indeed broken into Jonah's apartment that night. According to Michael's account, their intention was to steal valuable items from Jonah's apartment, but his friend grabbed a knife and attacked her. However, the detectives quickly became skeptical of his story. Firstly, the details Michael provided didn't match the actual facts. And secondly, there were no traces of the presence of two outsiders at the crime scene. The laboratory result only confirmed their skepticism. Michael's DNA and fingerprints did not match those found at the murder scene. The same applied to his shoes. The pattern on the soles was different from the footprint in Jason's room. Eventually, the police realized that the young man was simply lying. As strange as it may sound, such situations occur quite often. Many high-profile cases involve individuals who take on someone else's guilt. Some do it to seek attention, while others lie in hopes of receiving rewards for information. It's unknown what motives drove Michael, but his story turned out to be fabricated. Since then, investigators have interviewed over 1,000 potential suspects and collected around 400 DNA samples, but they haven't found a single match. From the early weeks of the investigation, a reward was announced for information leading to the resolution of the case. The amount increased each month and reached $60,000 in December of 2005, 1 year after the murder. The state governor added $20,000 from his own pocket, which further drew public attention. Despite the numerous leads, all of them proved to be dead ends, and the case remained unresolved for several years. In 2007, the victims' parents decided to advocate for changes in the state's legislation. They found it astonishing that the perpetrator's fingerprints and DNA were not found in any of the databases, considering the brutality of the crime. The parents refused to believe that it was his first offense. Later, they learned that under the laws of Tennessee, fingerprints and DNA samples were only taken from convicted criminals. Janna's parents resolved to rectify this situation and participated in the creation of a new law that mandated the collection of these samples from all individuals arrested for violent crimes. The authorities supported this initiative, and in May of 2007, such a law was enacted. 2 months later, a breakthrough finally occurred in the case. The police arrested 22-year-old Taylor Lee Olson for violating the terms of his parole. The man had been convicted of theft, and during a search of his home, marijuana bushes were discovered leading to his rearrest. Olson had an extensive criminal history, primarily consisting of thefts, check forgery, and car thefts. He had been arrested multiple times, but his fingerprints and DNA were never taken until now. Despite living with his girlfriend and their newborn daughter, Olson regularly committed crimes. It turned out that Olson had already come to the attention of investigators 5 months prior. They received a tip about his possible involvement in the murder, but for some reason, the police never attempted to take his DNA for analysis. However, now that he was arrested for violating the terms of his parole, they finally decided to question him about the Jonah case. Olson denied his involvement in the murder and willingly agreed to provide his DNA sample. It was handed over to experts, and soon the detectives received a report from the laboratory. Taylor's DNA fully matched the sample found in the victim's apartment. Following this, his fingerprints were taken, and they also matched the print found on the murder weapon. Olson was subsequently arrested, and the detectives brought him in for questioning. At first, he denied his guilt, but soon he decided to confess. Taylor explained that on that night he wanted to steal Jonah's car and entered the apartment through the back door to take the keys. When he entered the young woman's room, she woke up and started screaming. That's when Olson grabbed a kitchen knife and struck her multiple times, although he claimed he did not intend to kill anyone and it all happened accidentally. The detectives doubted the truthfulness of some aspects of his account and leaned toward the belief that Taylor had initially planned the murder. It was possible that he had been stalking the victim for some time, indirectly supported by a fact mentioned earlier in the investigation. Janna's friends told investigators that she had been followed by someone in a car. At the time, they couldn't find any evidence to confirm it, but after Olson's arrest, they considered the possibility that he had indeed been stalking her. Despite the doubts surrounding some details, nobody questioned Olson's guilt. His DNA and fingerprint were found on the murder weapon, indicating that he had inflicted the knife wounds on the victim. Olson's trial was scheduled to begin in mid-2008, and by that time, he had already hired a lawyer. Apparently, the lawyer advised him to retract his confession, and Taylor provided a new version of events to the detectives. Now he claimed that he had entered Janna's apartment together with his friend named Noah Cox. According to Olson, when he entered Jonah's room to take the car keys, she allegedly woke up, grabbed a knife, and struck him multiple times. Olson ran out of the apartment through the back door, while his friend went into Jonah's room, where he grabbed a knife from her and killed the young woman. This account also did not convince the police. No fingerprints or DNA of other individuals were found at the crime scene, making the involvement of someone else unlikely. The detectives were awaiting the start of the trial, but it was never meant to happen. On March 28, 2008, Taylor Olson ended his life in his prison cell. Several suicide notes addressed to his family, Jonah's relatives, and the police were found next to him. In the letter to the detectives, he once again claimed that his friend Noah Cox was the actual killer and apologized to Jonah's family and his own. The detectives continued to believe that Olson was the one who committed the murder, yet they repeatedly questioned Noah, but no evidence of his involvement could be found. Jonah's parents also believed that he lied. In their opinion, if Taylor was truly innocent, he would not have taken his own life. It was much more likely that he simply didn't want to spend his entire life in prison. Moreover, for several months after his confession, Olson continued to maintain that he entered the apartment alone and that no one was with him. If he was trying to protect his friend, why did he suddenly retract his confession and start accusing him of the murder? Kristin Rossom was born on October 25, 1976, into a very affluent family. Her father, Ralph Rossom, was a professor at Azusa Pacific University, where he taught constitutional law, and her mother, Constance Rossom, also worked there. Christine was the eldest child and had two brothers, Brand and Piers. They lived in Claremont, California, USA. Christine was highly talented, attending a children's modeling agency and professionally training in ballet and dance. However, a serious ankle injury that tore her ligaments forced Kristin to abandon her dream of becoming a professional dancer. The medical diagnosis was a devastating blow for her, as it meant her ankle joint would never fully recover its mobility, which was a huge tragedy for Kristin, from which she took a long time to recover. In 1991, her father assumed the presidency of Hampton-Sydney College, and the family relocated to Virginia. Kristin enrolled in an all-girls school in Richmond, where she began using alcohol, smoking marijuana, and later turned to using methamphetamine. Her parents were not pleased when they found out about her addiction and tried various ways to divert her from these destructive habits. Their relationship with their daughter became seriously strained during this time. They argued, locked her at home, withdrew financial support, and even had to involve the police on occasion. Kristin's parents made incredible efforts to help their daughter overcome her addiction and return to a normal life. And finally, in 1994, she succeeded. Kristin got a job at the University of Redlands, and it seemed like her life was getting back on track. However, in 1995, she had a nervous breakdown, quit her job, and relapsed into substance abuse. Ultimately, she attempted to take her own life, but thanks to medical intervention, her attempt was unsuccessful, and she was saved. To try to divert her from the negative path she was on, her parents sent Kristin to travel to the city of Tijuana on the border of Mexico and the United States, where she crossed paths with 22-year-old student Gregory DeVillers, who was also traveling there with his brothers at the time. An instant attraction developed between Kristin and Gregory, which quickly blossomed into true love at first sight. After spending several days together, they decided to start dating upon returning home. Kristin and Greg grew close very quickly, with Kristin openly sharing her struggles with depression and the addiction she had not yet fully overcome. Greg understood that Kristin's involvement with illicit substances could harm their relationship, but his feelings for Kristin were so strong that he promised to support her through this challenge. He cared for her, putting incredible effort into helping her overcome her destructive habit. In the end, Greg's efforts were not in vain, and thanks to his unwavering support, Kristin managed to overcome her addiction and completely break free from everything that had been detrimental to her health and well-being, an achievement that had seemed impossible not long ago. With Greg and her family's support, Kristin enrolled in San Diego State University and graduated with honors in 1998, leading her to secure a position as a toxicologist in the San Diego County Medical Examiner's Office. By that time, Greg had already completed his university education and worked for several years in an analytical agency. On June 5, 1999, the couple tied the knot and celebrated a lavish wedding. Gregory and Kristin's marriage lasted just over a year and a half, and initially, everything was more than wonderful. They were both young and happy. However, on one ordinary day, Greg was found unconscious in their bedroom, creating a perplexing scene for the paramedics and the police. Gregory was discovered unconscious on the bedroom floor amidst rose petals. A wedding photograph lay near the pillow, and crumpled pages from his wife Kristin's diary were found scattered on the floor. The police immediately found this whole scenario eerily reminiscent of a scene from the movie American Beauty. Gregory was quickly rushed to the hospital, where medical professionals declared him deceased upon arrival. Kristin immediately made an official statement to the authorities, claiming that her husband had taken his own life. She told detectives that on the previous day he had been deeply upset and depressed, had consumed a significant amount of alcohol, and had taken powerful antidepressants. The San Diego police did not rush to investigate, primarily because everything appeared to be fairly straightforward, and they did not want to get involved with Kristin's family. Greg's family was shocked by his death and refused to believe that their son could commit such an impulsive act. He was a lively, successful, young, and healthy individual who had no history of substance abuse. One of Greg's brothers, Jerome, was convinced that something was amiss and suspected that Kristin might somehow be involved in his brother's death. Jerome had his reasons for distrusting Kristin. He shared an incident that occurred when all three of them were students. Greg and Jerome shared an apartment during their university days, and when Kristin entered Greg's life, she moved into the apartment with them. For a while, everything seemed fine. They coexisted peacefully. However, at some point, Jerome noticed that various items, cash, and checks were mysteriously disappearing. Naturally, Suspicions fell on Kristin, and despite her denials, the missing items were found in one of her purses. This led to a serious rift between the brothers, and Jerome was forced to leave the apartment. Unlike his brother, Jerome never truly believed in Kristin, considering her a pathological liar and a manipulator of emotions. Based on his suspicions, Jerome regularly contacted the police and requested a reinvestigation into the mysterious death of his brother, Gregory de Villiers. In the end, investigators found Jerome's arguments not entirely baseless and decided to reopen the case. Due to the potential conflict of interest, investigators sent the initial autopsy results of Gregory de Villiers to an independent laboratory located in Los Angeles. During the subsequent laboratory examinations, a lethal dose of fentanyl was found in the young man's body, exceeding the permissible limit by 7 times. The police were deeply perplexed by this fact, particularly considering that the initial autopsy and forensic examination had been conducted in a laboratory where Kristin's spouse worked, and nothing suspicious had been discovered during the autopsy. Furthermore, the fact that the person responsible for the autopsy was none other than Michael Robertson, the immediate superior of Kristin, also piqued the interest of law enforcement. Investigators also requested recordings of conversations between Kristin and the emergency room doctor and interviewed the police officer present at the scene after discovering the body and at the hospital where Greg was taken. The police officer claimed to have witnessed Kristin being visited by a man whom she embraced, and it turned out to be none other than Michael Robertson. Continuing their investigation, detectives uncovered the following. Michael Robertson, of Australian origin, had recently been hired in the forensic medicine department as Kristin's boss. Despite the fact that the young woman had just gotten married, an extramarital relationship quickly developed between her and her boss, which went beyond professional boundaries. This was happening in plain view of their colleagues, and it seemed that only her spouse was unaware of it. Furthermore, investigators discovered that Kristin had resumed using illicit substances, to which she now had unrestricted access due to her responsibilities, which included registering confiscated substances stored in their laboratory. Upon learning about his lover's destructive addiction, Michael Robertson not only failed to intervene, as proper procedure required in such cases, but also chose to cover for her by falsifying certain documents. After the police uncovered these facts, they decided to conduct searches in the offices of Kristin and Michael. They discovered that the couple had recently participated in a conference where they presented research, sponsored by their employer, discussing fentanyl research and its effects on the human body. 1 month after Gregory's death, Rossom and Robertson were fired from the medical examiner's office. She for concealing her methamphetamine addiction, and he for enabling her drug use and engaging in a sexual relationship with a subordinate. Step by step, the police pieced together the events, gathering more and more evidence in favor of Kristin's culpability in her husband's death. In June 2001, 7 months after his death, Kristin Rossom was arrested and charged with premeditated murder. During interrogations, she recounted her version of the events leading up to her husband's death. Greg discovered his wife's affair with her boss entirely by chance when he found a love letter that had fallen from her purse. A serious argument erupted between the spouses, and in his anger, Greg threatened to expose the truth to her employer and her parents, among other things. This was the turning point in the decision to physically eliminate her husband. Kristin was aware that the consequences of this case becoming public could be catastrophic for her and her lover. Besides the risk of losing their jobs, they could face criminal charges. Since the argument between the couple occurred late in the evening, Kristin suggested postponing their discussion until the morning. The following day, waking up next to her husband, Kristin realized he didn't look well. Therefore, she offered him a headache and depression pill. After some time, Greg's condition not only failed to improve but worsened. He experienced dizziness and was on the verge of losing consciousness. Taking matters into her own hands, Kristin sent a text message to her husband's boss, apologizing for him and stating that her spouse couldn't come to work that day due to feeling unwell. She then left for work herself. During her lunch break, Kristin returned home supposedly to have lunch with her husband. Seeing that he hadn't improved, she left Greg home alone again and returned to her office. When she finished work and left the office at 5:00 p.m., Kristin decided to go shopping. Upon returning home around 7:30 p.m., she found her husband asleep, presumably still under the influence of the antidepressants he had taken earlier in the day. She went to take a bath, and at around 9:00 p.m., Kristin found herself in bed next to her husband. At that moment, she realized that her husband wasn't breathing. His complete lack of response caused panic, and suspecting that her husband was unconscious due to an apparent overdose of sleeping pills, she called the emergency services. On January 4, 2002, Kristin's parents posted a bail of $1, $25 million for her, and took her out of the pretrial detention facility. While the investigation was ongoing, the young woman remained free. The trial began in late 2002. The prosecution claimed that Kristin Rossom intentionally killed her husband to prevent him from revealing to her superiors that she was having an affair with the chief toxicologist, Robertson, and that she was using methamphetamine that she stole from the laboratory. In contrast, the defense attorneys argued that Greg was prone to suicide and had poisoned himself. Detectives presented compelling evidence that the young woman had acted deliberately and with cold calculation. According to eyewitness accounts on the day of Greg's death, Kristin was observed having a lengthy conversation with Michael Robertson. Additionally, when she went shopping, she intentionally paid in cash to avoid leaving a trace of her purchases without a cash receipt or surveillance camera footage. However, she made a small oversight. Before paying for her purchases, she presented her Vons store loyalty card, and the system automatically recorded a list of her selected items during the order process. Among other things on this list was a red rose. Investigators also discovered that shortly before her husband's death, Kristin had signed an agreement to donate his organs, and at the same time, she was preparing for his cremation. Such promptness in her actions raised significant suspicions with the investigators, as it was evident that she was trying to cover her tracks in the crime. On November 12, 2002, Kristin Rossom was found guilty of first-degree murder by a jury, and on December 12, she was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole and fined $10,000. She was sent to the Women's Institution of Central California in Chowchilla, the largest women's correctional facility in the USA. Michael Robertson, after being fired from the medical examiner's office, returned to Australia. He was named as a co-conspirator during Rossom's trial, but as of 2012, he had not been extradited to the United States to face charges in Greg DeVilliers' murder. In 2006, Greg DeVilliers' family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Kristin. On March 25, 2006, a San Diego jury ordered her to pay punitive damages in excess of $100 million. The family's attorney stated that they might never see this money, but it was done to prevent Kristin from profiting from her crime, as she intended to sell the rights to make a movie and write a book about her story. Greg's parents never fully recovered for the loss of their son. They were shocked by the cynicism with which the young man had been killed. He was very kind to Kristin, loved her, supported her, and believed in her. However, due to her troubled psyche, she failed to appreciate this and chose to turn to the dark side of her destructive addiction. Instead of addressing the problems in their marriage and opting for a divorce, she decided to poison her husband. Interestingly, Kristin showed no remorse for her crime. She blamed everything on Greg, saying that he smothered her with his love and did not give her the freedom she so desperately needed. During the trial, she behaved like a television star, drawing the attention of reporters. While cameras were not allowed in the courtroom during the actual trial, they closely followed her fashionable entrances and exits. Kristin repeatedly attempted to file appeals claiming the unfairness of her sentence, but each time, she received a denial. On September 3, 2011, the U.S. Court of Appeals issued a final rejection. Sierra Joggin was born on February 11, 1996, in the small American town of Delta, Ohio. The girl grew up in a very large and friendly family. She had 2 sisters and 2 brothers. Sierra loved to play sports and was on the school volleyball team. She also loved to travel. The girl dreamed of visiting Italy and put a lot of effort into making that wish come true until she finally managed to go there. During her studies, she started dating a guy named Josh. After graduating high school, they went to different universities. Sierra planned to get a job with her uncle, who owned a metal fabrication company, and the young woman decided, to major in human resources. She enrolled at Toledo University, located 50 kilometers from her home. Despite the distance, she and Josh planned to keep dating and made plans for their future. The couple even began to take their time choosing engagement rings for their future wedding. After 2 years at university, the young woman went to her hometown for a summer vacation. At that point, she still had some schoolwork to close, but she decided to do it from home so she could spend more time with her family and her boyfriend. In addition to that, Sierra was also doing an internship with her uncle's company. She was in her 20s at the time, and the young woman was thoroughly preparing to work there after graduation. On July 19, 2016, Sierra decided to drive to her boyfriend's house. She had bought a new bike a few days before, and she couldn't wait to try it out. The young woman left the house at about 5 p.m. and headed toward Josh's house. Around 9 p.m., her mother came home and found her daughter not there. This struck her as a little strange. She thought Sierra would have come home by now, but it was summer and it was just starting to get dark outside. Besides, the young woman was already in her 20s and her mother didn't worry about it. She had assumed that her daughter would stay at the boyfriend's house, but that all changed when Josh called her at 10:30 p.m. He asked if Sarah was home, since the boyfriend couldn't reach her. According to the young man, they broke up at about 7 p.m. and she hasn't been in touch since. Considering that more than 3 hours had passed since then, the young woman's mother began to get seriously worried. Together with Josh, they started calling friends and relatives of the young woman, hoping she had stopped by one of them. But no one had seen her that night. Then the mother called all the nearby hospitals, but there was no one there either. Eventually, the woman decided to go to the police, and around midnight, she filed a missing persons report. Despite the fact that Sierra was 20 years old, the police immediately began their search. Given that Josh was the last person to see her, they went to him. The guy said that the young woman arrived at his house shortly after 5 p.m. After about an hour and a half, they decided to go for a ride together. Sierra rode her bike and Josh rode his motorcycle. The couple rode along country roads, along numerous cornfields. Josh even took a picture of Sierra on her bike, and the young woman posted it on social media. After riding around for a while, they decided to go their separate ways. Sierra and Josh separated about a mile away from her house. The guy rode back on his motorcycle, and she headed home on her bike. While the police talked to the young man, other officers drove around looking for Sierra. They headed for the road near where the young woman had begun her journey home alone, and soon they were able to spot the first disturbing tip-off. As they drove along the road along the fields, one of the officers saw that the corn stalks in one place were heavily pinched, as if someone had waded through them. He walked over there with a flashlight and after a few yards saw Sierra's bicycle. On examining it, the policeman saw traces of blood on the handles and seat. Next to the bicycle was a woman's sock, which also had bloodstains on it. He reported the find to his colleagues, and soon other police officers arrived on the scene. On closer inspection, they found several other items not far from the bike. There were men's sunglasses, a screwdriver, and some car fuses. Just as interesting was the fact that motorcycle tire tracks led to the bicycle across the cornfield. All this was enough for the investigators to come to a disappointing conclusion. It was likely that Sarah had been stolen. As the case took a serious turn, they began to look closely at Josh as a possible suspect. First of all, statistically speaking, it is the people closest to them who are most likely to turn out to be the perpetrators. Secondly, that night Josh was riding a motorcycle, and next to the bike Sierra found similar tire tracks. Besides that, the detectives wondered why the guy didn't walk the young woman home. She had less than a mile to go, and he was on a motorcycle and could have gotten home quickly anyway. Josh allowed the police officers to look around his house, his car, and his motorcycle, and that's where the officers came across his work overalls, which showed signs of blood. The young man said he wore the clothes when he was hunting, and the blood belonged to animals. Investigators turned the overalls over to experts, and they quickly confirmed that he was telling the truth. Otherwise, there was nothing to suggest Josh was involved. The experts also examined the items found in the field and extracted one DNA sample from them that belonged to an unknown person. Josh immediately volunteered his sample, and they did not match. As a result, he was no longer considered a suspect, and the police started looking for other leads. The next day, they received a call from a farmer. The man told them that on the evening of Sierra's disappearance, he was driving down the same road with his son. At one point, they noticed a motorcycle helmet on the side of the road, and the father told his son to bring it to the car. The farmer later examined it more closely and saw traces of blood on it, and then contacted the police. Detectives admitted that the helmet may have belonged to the kidnapper, but his identity remained a mystery. At this point, the FBI was already involved in the case, and the agents decided to take a close look at the photo that Josh had taken of Sierra shortly before her disappearance. Thanks to the photo, they knew what kind of clothes she was wearing, but the detectives noticed something else. The young woman was wearing a fitness bracelet on her wrist. They immediately requested geolocation data for the device, but here the investigators were unsuccessful. The device had been turned off shortly after Sierra disappeared. The police received another tip shortly thereafter. Josh told them that as he and the young woman were driving down the road, a suspicious white van followed them. The guy got the feeling that the driver was following them. The vehicle was traveling at a slow speed and slowed down when the couple slowed down. At one point, Josh even tried to drive up to him, but the driver pulled away. The guy thought it was strange, and he even remembered part of his license plate number. The police quickly found the vehicle and its owner. She turned out to be a woman, and detectives determined that she had nothing to do with the crime. During the conversation, she herself accused Josh of trying to drive up to her and push her off the road. As a result, investigators decided that there had simply been a miscommunication between them and continued to look for more leads. Several days had passed since Sierra's disappearance, but the police were still unable to find any additional clues. Then, they decided to go through all the residents who had been previously convicted of violent crimes and lived in nearby communities. Going through the list of these people, they immediately noticed one man, 57-year-old James Warley. He lived only a few kilometers from the field where Sierra's bicycle was found. The reason the police were so interested in him was very simple. James had been convicted of kidnapping a young woman in the 1990s. She was riding her bicycle when suddenly a man ran over her in his van. Threatening her with a screwdriver, he tried to force the young woman into the car, but she managed to escape. Given that Sierra disappeared during the bike ride and the screwdriver found next to him, police quickly suspected James of kidnapping her. Investigators went to him to verify this theory. The man was clearly unhappy about the visit and stated that he had not killed anyone. Nevertheless, he voluntarily allowed the officers to inspect his home. James and his mother lived on a 120-acre farm, and there were many different structures on this huge property. It took the detectives a long time to look at them all. During this process, James kept repeating to the police that he had not kidnapped Sierra and had only heard about the case from the news. This behavior began to seem strange to them. The man was literally repeating the same thing over and over again, but something more interestingly awaited them next. Suddenly, James said that on the night of Sierra's disappearance, he had just driven along that road and his motorcycle had stalled near the very spot where the police later found the young woman's bicycle. According to James, he saw her bike and decided to get closer, so he headed into the field, pushing his motorcycle nearby. The man added that as he walked there, his car fuses, sunglasses, screwdriver, and helmet fell out. Suddenly, his motorcycle started up again and James drove on, forgetting to pick up all those items. As you might have guessed, the detectives were very suspicious of this story. In addition, just a few hours earlier, a witness had approached them and said that the evening of Sierra's disappearance, he had seen a strange van on that road. The witness noticed it because the vehicle was driving at a very high speed, breaking all possible rules. He memorized the license plate number and gave that information to the police. After running the plates, detectives learned that the van belonged to James, and during a search, they spotted it near the house. The man also allowed them to examine the van, and the officers found something of interest. Inside were a ski mask, duct tape, plastic clamps, handcuffs, and a mace. The items themselves did not in any way indicate his guilt, but given James' criminal record for kidnapping, such a set made investigators suspicious. But the creepiest finds awaited them in one of the barns. Detectives found a separate room where behind a hidden door, inside which was an air mattress. Beside it were chains that looked as if they had been designed to keep a person in the room. Next to the mattress was a refrigerator, inside of which the police found traces of blood. There was also a strong smell of bleach, from which they deduced that the blood had been thoroughly cleaned. But the main clue was the contents of a small box. There were bras and several pairs of women's underwear, one of which had blood on it. All this was enough to arrest James, at least temporarily, while experts examined the collected evidence. The man was taken in for questioning and asked to explain the secret room with the blood and chains. In response, James gave them another dubious story. He said he had made the room because he wanted to set up his own studio to shoot adult material, so it was just his improvised film set. Of course, the detectives didn't believe what he said. The room looked as if it had originally been made to hold people against their will. Nevertheless, they still could not connect it to Sierra's disappearance, nor could they determine her whereabouts. But that all changed on the third day after her disappearance. During a lengthy search, the police found a freshly dug grave in a field that contained Sierra's body. Her hands were handcuffed, and the young woman had a large plastic toy in her mouth. She was also wearing an adult diaper. Medical examiners determined that the victim died from strangulation, but they were unable to determine even the approximate time of death. In addition, they did not find any signs of violence. Around the same time, forensic scientists were actively examining all the evidence collected from James' barn. They found female DNA on one of the pieces of duct tape lying next to the mattress, and it matched Sierra's DNA. The cops also obtained geolocation data on James' smartphone. It turned out that on the night of the young woman's disappearance, he had spent almost 2 hours near that location. They received another disturbing piece of evidence from the psychologist James had court appointed for a previous abduction. According to him, during one of his sessions, James stated that he was learning from his mistakes with each new abduction and that next time he was going to bury the bodies. Apparently, the psychologist decided not to inform the police of such disturbing statements made by his client and did so only after he had been accused of murder. With this set of clues, the detectives formed the most likely chronology of events. Apparently, James spotted Sierra on the road that night, hit her with his helmet, and dragged her into a field with his bicycle. Based on his geolocation data, the man sat there until the sun went down. During that time, he called his brother and told him that his motorcycle had broken down. Apparently, this was his way of creating an alibi. As soon as it got dark outside, James drove home, got off his motorcycle onto his van, and returned to the field, picked up Sierra, and took her to his barn. At that point, the young woman was either unconscious or restrained. What happened next only James knew. He apparently abused the victim for some time before killing her and burying her in a field. Experts only speculated that the victim may have been there for 3 days. The man himself continued to deny all of these allegations, and the case went to trial. The trial began in March 2018 with the prosecution presenting additional evidence that further pointed to his guilt. It turned out that the key to the handcuffs placed on the victim's hands was found on James' keychain. His lawyers decided to stick with the theory that James simply wanted to set up an adult film studio in his barn, and the cops pulled that into the murder. However, they did not provide any adequate arguments for their client's innocence. The trial ended in less than a month, and on March 28th, the jury found him guilty. As a result, James received the death penalty, his execution scheduled for May 20th, 2025. Of course, this story was far from over for the detectives. Given everything they had learned about the man, the police were certain that James had committed similar crimes before, but he had managed to avoid responsibility. Investigators were still working on his case, trying to tie the unsolved disappearances to James, but it had yet to yield concrete results. The victim's parents established the Sierra Scholarship and also participated in the creation of a bill that would have required the state to make an open registry of people previously convicted of murder and kidnapping. The bill was quickly supported and went into effect on March 20th, 2019. Riley Goodrich was born and raised in the American city of Corona, California. In school, she played volleyball and was a cheerleader, as well as had many friends. They described her as a positive, open, and fun-loving young woman with a big heart. After graduating from high school, Riley received a scholarship to Grand Canyon University in Arizona. She moved to a dormitory but tried to visit her family whenever possible. In the summer of 2021, she finished her first year and returned to Corona for the holidays. On July 4th, on Independence Day, her friends threw a big party. There, Riley met a young man named Anthony Baraja, who was a year older than her. They quickly developed a liking for each other and continued to communicate in the following days. Anthony unexpectedly became a popular figure on TikTok. In 2019, he created an account where he posted various humorous videos. At some point, his videos began to attract the attention of a wide audience, and by the summer of 2021, he had almost 1 million subscribers. The guy also actively developed his account on Instagram, but was still trying to figure out what to do in the future. Continue to run his blog as his main activity, or do something else. After chatting for some time on social media, they decided to go on a first date, but it was important for Riley that her father Dave approved of her choice. Despite the fact that she was already 18 years old at that time, the young woman was very close to her parents and wanted them to meet Anthony first. At first, the young woman's father was skeptical, mostly because Anthony made a living through TikTok. It all seemed not very serious to him. However, when they met in person, Anthony made a good impression on Dave, and the father approved of his daughter's choice. The guy seemed to him kind, well-mannered, and overall a positive person. In the end, Riley and Anthony decided to meet on July 26 and go to an evening movie session, choosing the movie The Forever Purge. The plot of the film is based on the fact that in the United States, every year they legalize any crime for 12 hours, including murder. Who would have thought how creepy of a coincidence it would be to choose this movie. Before heading to the cinema, they had dinner at their favorite restaurant, Riley, located nearby. Their screening started at 9:30 p.m. and ended closer to midnight. Considering it was a weekday, there were not many people in the theater. During the movie, Riley messaged her mother that the film seemed boring to her, but she still enjoyed the date with Anthony. The young woman did not contact her mother anymore after that. When the movie ended, a theater employee went into the hall to clean up the room. To his surprise, he found Riley and Anthony there. From a distance, it seemed to him that the couple was just sitting or sleeping in their seats. But as soon as he took a few steps towards them, he was horrified to discover that both visitors were seriously wounded and unconscious. After calling 911, the police and ambulance arrived at the scene. The medics almost immediately determined that Riley had already passed away. Anthony was still alive, but in a serious unconscious condition. He was taken to the local hospital and connected to life support equipment, while detectives began investigating the crime scene. At first, it was difficult for them to understand what had happened in the theater. The only thing they managed to establish almost immediately was the fact that Riley and Anthony were shot in the head. However, there were no clues at the crime scene that could shed light on what had happened. Of course, it was absolutely useless for detectives to take fingerprints or search for DNA samples in the cinema, so they went a different way. Almost immediately, the story spread through California media and later throughout the country. In the first hours of the investigation, there was even a theory that Anthony could have been the killer, allegedly shooting Riley and then taking his own life. But the police did not even consider this version, if only because, in that case, the weapon would have been lying nearby and it was nowhere to be found. As soon as the detectives identified the victims' identities, they contacted their families and informed them of what had happened. Riley's parents simply could not believe that their daughter was dead. Just a few minutes before her death, she was texting with her mother, and no one could have thought that something so tragic could happen during a movie screening. In addition, the police could not provide any details to her relatives about what had happened, as they themselves still had no idea what had happened in that theater. As for Anthony, the doctor's prognosis was bleak. The young man had suffered a serious injury, and the medical staff had to do everything possible to help him. First, the detectives questioned the theater employees who worked that evening. It turned out that only 6 tickets were sold for the showing. This meant that the killer was most likely one of the 4 visitors. There was another aspect that puzzled not only the police, but also everyone who learned about this incident from the news. If the killer was one of the 6 viewers, how did the other 2 visitors not hear the sounds of gunfire? The only explanation at that time was the version that the other 2 viewers simply took the sounds of gunfire as part of the movie. This action movie had many violent scenes, including the use of weapons. The theory that the killer struck during one of these scenes was not excluded. However, this mystery was quickly solved. Detectives found that out of all the tickets sold, 4 were purchased by one person for himself and 3 of his friends. This led the police to think that the crime could have been committed by a group of people. The investigation continued all night, and the next day, the police announced the arrest of the suspect. He turned out to be 20-year-old Joseph Jimenez. The interesting fact here is that pure chance helped to catch the suspect. It turned out that Joseph himself called the police the next day after the murder, but he did not do this to confess to the crime. At around 9:30 p.m., Joseph called 911 and reported that someone was chasing him. When the police arrived, they found him in the middle of the street with a gun in his hand and arrested him. They immediately realized that the attack in the theater was carried out using a weapon of the same caliber, so they handed Joseph's gun over to the experts. Having 3 empty shells from the theater in their hands, they established that this was the same weapon. Jimenez denied his involvement in the murder, but the detectives quickly found another weighty evidence. Searching the suspect's house, they found Riley Goodrich's wallet there. Later, the police located the other 3 individuals who were at the movie theater with Joseph. It turned out that they were all friends with him, but their story truly shocked the detectives. According to them, none of them had any idea that a simple trip to the movies would turn into such a tragedy. They were just sitting and watching the film, but during the screening they began to notice something strange. Joseph suddenly began to behave very suspiciously. He was talking to himself and muttering something unintelligible. At some point he said that he needed to go to the bathroom and left. However, instead of going to the bathroom, he went to his car, took out a gun, and returned. After sitting for some time, he suddenly told his friends that he had brought a gun from his car, and they began to panic. In the end, the friends allegedly lied to him, saying that they also needed to use the bathroom and would return. But instead, they left and went outside. There were many strange moments in their story that could be doubted. The most concerning part was their escape from the theater. Did they really not try to find out why Joseph brought a gun, and did they not consider that he might use it against the two other moviegoers? Moreover, the friends did not report any of this to theater staff or the police. Joseph's behavior, practically indisputable, indicated that he was planning to do something bad. But his friends decided to simply ignore the entire situation, and they admitted that as soon as they heard about the murder, they immediately thought of Joseph. All of this was enough to arrest Jimenez on 3 charges: murder, attempted murder, and robbery. At that time, Anthony was still on life support, but in the end, the doctors could not help him. On the evening of July 31st, he passed away without regaining consciousness. In connection with this, Joseph was charged with an additional count of murder, which carried the possibility of a death sentence. While detectives tried to get any information from him, hundreds of concerned people held a farewell ceremony in memory of Riley and Anthony outside the movie theater. They lit candles and expressed words of support to the families of the victims. It was then that it became known that long before the incident, Anthony had signed papers allowing his organs to be donated to those in need in the event of his death. The young man could hardly have imagined that it would happen so soon. The situation was not looking good for Joseph Jimenez. With the evidence against him, he was almost guaranteed to end up on death row. Apparently, he understood this perfectly and decided to confess to the crime. However, his story raised even more questions. Joseph claimed that he was diagnosed with schizophrenia 9 months ago, which he had been managing with medication. Shortly before the incident, he stopped taking his medication, and voices started to appear in his head. At first, they told him that someone was going to steal his car and TV, but later they threatened to kill his entire family. On the night at the cinema, he heard the voices again, and this time, they ordered him to kill Riley and Anthony. They also promised to kill his entire family if he refused. According to Jimenez, he tried to resist these voices, but in the end he gave in and committed the crime. In his speech, he devoted a lot of attention to how scared he was during the murder and in the following hours, as well as how he worried about his future. Of course, this turn in the case was perceived ambiguously. Let's look at the facts and try to understand if we can trust him. Could Joseph have made up this whole story about the voices? Of course. Moreover, only serious mental problems could have saved him from the death penalty in this case, so it was his only chance to avoid such a sentence. In addition, the petty theft of Riley's wallet does not fit into his story, according to which Joseph was so frightened that he immediately ran out of the cinema and got into his car after the shots. Who, in a panic, is going to steal a wallet? On the other hand, there are still many strange moments in his actions. If we believe his friends, he talked to himself and behaved suspiciously. In addition, Joseph himself called the police, saying that someone was chasing him, but in reality, he was just standing in the middle of the street with a gun. If we assume that all of this was a planned game, the plan to avoid responsibility seems too complicated. But if we still consider such an option, the situation could have developed in a completely different way. During the movie, Joseph realized that there were only two random people in the theater who he could rob. He went to his car to get a weapon, but something went wrong, or perhaps he truly intended to commit murder. It's possible his friends were even present at the time and didn't leave the theater. However, it's unclear why he didn't take the victim's smartphones if that was his motive, and why did he call the police the next day instead of hoping not to be caught. Additionally, Joseph had no criminal history and had never been in trouble even for minor offenses. It's hard to imagine someone without a criminal past suddenly committing double murder over a wallet, especially with such a high likelihood of being caught. In late September, the first court hearing took place, during which Joseph pleaded not guilty, citing his mental state. This doesn't mean he denies involvement in the murders, but now the court needed to consider the issue of his sanity. Jimenez stated that he would only plead guilty if deemed insane. The next court hearing was scheduled for the first half of 2022. A decision about the defendant's mental state has not yet been made, as he still needs to undergo evaluation. In any case, whatever the outcome of this case, it is shocking in its injustice. The two innocent young men simply wanted to spend an evening at the movies and ended up as victims of a completely random act of aggression. The public and media blamed the theater management for not checking Joseph upon entering the theater. But should they be blamed? In the United States, theater staff only check backpacks and bags to prevent visitors from bringing in outside food. But if someone brings a gun and hides it under their clothes, no one will ever know. The only thing that can be done in such a situation is to install metal detectors in every theater. Perhaps this will become a mandatory requirement over time. What do you think? Was Joseph truly mentally ill and that led to his horrific act? Or was the story about the voices fabricated to avoid a death sentence? Sherry Rasmussen was born on February 7, 1957, in the state of Washington. She grew up in a large and friendly family with two sisters and loving parents. Later, they moved to the city of Tucson, Arizona, where Sherry attended the local school. She was an excellent student and even finished elementary school a year ahead of her peers. Sherry completed the entire 7th grade program on summer vacation by herself. After graduating from high school in 1973, she enrolled in a California college, where her older sister was already studying. In her first year, Sherry decided to pursue a medical education and become a nurse, for which she had to take additional courses at another institution. After graduating from college in 1975, Sherry decided to get a master's degree at the University of California, Los Angeles, and also worked there as a nurse to pay for her education. After receiving her master's degree at the age of 23, her father bought her an apartment in the suburbs of Los Angeles. But Sherry did not want to live off her parents, so she wrote her father a check every month for the entire amount of the mortgage payments. She also got a job at a local hospital, heading the nursing department for caring for seriously ill people. In May 1984, when Sherry was 27 years old, she met a man named John Rutan. They immediately hit it off and the couple started dating. John had a good education, worked as a computer engineer, and was a very intelligent young man. A year later, the couple decided to get married, and after that, John moved into Sherry's apartment. The newlyweds spent their honeymoon in Jamaica, after which they returned home to celebrate Christmas with Sherry's family. It seemed that this couple was destined for a happy and carefree future. On February 24th of the following year, when John was getting ready for work as usual, Sherry complained of feeling unwell and decided to stay home. She asked John to call her in a few hours. At around 7:20 a.m., John left for work. Closer to 10 a.m., John tried to reach her by phone, but she didn't answer. Half an hour later, he tried again, but still no answer. So he called her workplace to check if she had gone to work, but Sherry hadn't shown up at the hospital either. Her sister also tried to reach her, but without success. John returned home from work at around 6 p.m. and immediately noticed something strange. The garage door was open, even though he had closed it in the morning, and Sherry's car was missing. Therefore, he first thought that she had gone somewhere. As he approached the garage, he saw a lot of broken glass and immediately discovered its source. There was a small balcony above the garage with a glass door which had been smashed. He entered the house through the garage and, to his horror, found Sherry there. She was lying on the floor, her body badly disfigured. John immediately called the police and detectives began to examine the crime scene. In all the rooms there was complete chaos. Broken vases, overturned furniture, scattered items. A bloody handprint was found on the wall next to the alarm button. Apparently, the victim tried to reach it, but failed. In addition to extensive bruises and wounds, experts noticed a human bite mark on Sherry's wrist. Apart from all of the above, the marks on her hands indicated that the attacker tied up the victim before untying her. The cause of death was 3 close-range gunshot wounds. Detectives found a blanket with bullet holes in the apartment and concluded that the attacker wrapped the gun in it to muffle the sound of the shots. Detectives immediately concluded that there was a prolonged struggle between the attacker and Sherry. This was evidenced by the amount of scattered and broken items throughout the apartment, as well as a bloody mark next to the alarm button. The lead investigator quickly concluded that they were dealing with a failed robbery. According to his opinion, at least 2 criminals broke into Sherry's apartment, but they didn't expect her to be home. A struggle ensued between them and Sherry fought for her life until the end. Several facts supported the robbery version. Firstly, Sherry's car disappeared from the garage. Secondly, someone had placed the stereo equipment and player next to the staircase leading to the second floor. According to the police, the robbers wanted to take them and leave, but after the scuffle and murder, they fled the scene. However, there were some dubious moments in this version. Firstly, the police did not find any signs of forced entry. This meant that either Sherry let the criminals in herself or they had a key. Secondly, the perpetrators did not touch absolutely all the valuable items, including the jewelry box standing in plain sight. Detectives interviewed all of Sherry's neighbors, but it didn't yield any new leads. Some residents heard the sounds of a struggle, but not gunshots. They also didn't see anyone entering the woman's apartment. Experts took blood samples and fingerprints from the house, but they couldn't conduct DNA analysis in 1985. The lead investigator also took a piece of cotton and soaked it in the trace of the bite on Sherry's body. He hoped that the attacker's saliva could be left behind, and eventually, experts could use this clue to catch the killer. After a thorough search of the apartment, detectives learned one interesting fact. It turned out that the criminals took only one thing: Sherry and John's marriage certificate. This was very strange and also raised suspicions about the man himself, but his alibi was unquestionable. John was at work until the evening, and he simply couldn't have committed this crime. Moreover, he himself told the police about the disappearance of this document. Detectives were unable to find an explanation for this strange fact. After a week and a half, they found Sherry's car in a parking lot 4 kilometers from her apartment. It was unlocked and the keys were in the ignition. Forensic experts tried to find fingerprints, but they were unsuccessful. Either the criminals only touched it with gloves on, or they wiped away all the fingerprints. 2 months after the murder that took place just a few hundred meters from Sherry's home, a robbery occurred. Detectives immediately found many similarities. 2 criminals broke into a stranger's apartment through the garage, threatened the owner with a gun, and stole stereo equipment. The lead investigator immediately thought that these 2 were behind the woman's murder, so the police tried to find them. From witness accounts, they created approximate composite sketches of the suspects and also learned that both men were Latino, but they were never found. However, investigators did not show much interest in getting to the truth, which constantly irritated Sherry's parents. Her father regularly went to the police station, inquired about the progress of the investigation, and asked the detectives to consider different versions. Once he even asked them to take a closer look at John's ex-girlfriend, Stephanie Lazarus, who was a police officer herself. Sherry had told her father several times that she was obsessed with John, but the investigators only laughed at this version. They told him to watch fewer detective shows. The thing was that Stephanie couldn't accept John's departure. Learning that he was going to marry another woman, she came to Sherry's workplace. Stephanie told her that their marriage was doomed and that she and John would be together again sooner or later. In addition, she said that John had slept with her already after becoming engaged to Sherry. Of course, after this visit, Sherry was deeply upset. Upon returning home, she told John what had happened, and he admitted that he had indeed slept with Stephanie. After she found out about his engagement, the young woman begged him to come over, spoke of her love, and urged him to return to her. But he said he loved Sherry and intended to marry her. Then Stephanie offered to sleep with him one last time, and John agreed. He apologized to Sherry and said it was a huge mistake on his part. The woman forgave him, and this incident with Stephanie gradually faded away. But the story didn't end there. Stephanie came to their home several times without warning under various pretexts. Once she came with a set of skis and announced that John promised to wax them for her. The next time she entered their apartment when the man was not at home. Sherry did not even hear how she entered the room and was shocked to see Stephanie in her living room. When asked what she was doing there, the woman said she came to talk to John. Sherry had a hard time convincing her to leave. Later, she even thought of going to the police about this incident, but did not. The woman was afraid that if she told about the harassment by their own employee, they would just laugh at her. She also wondered how Stephanie managed to enter the residential complex. It was surrounded by a high fence, and a special pass was required to enter. Apparently, the woman used her police badge, and the security let her in. As for Stephanie's apartment, there had to be a duplicate key. Otherwise, she simply could not have entered without breaking the lock. In addition to this, Sherry repeatedly noticed that someone was following her. Once, she and John were sitting in a restaurant, and the woman saw someone staring at them intently. As soon as she looked at this person, he immediately left. Sherry did not see his face because it was covered with a hood. Unknown calls also regularly came to their home phone, and Sherry suspected it could be Stephanie. The victim's father told detectives about all these incidents, but they did not attach any importance to his words. They were sure that the murder was committed by the two Mexicans who robbed an apartment near Sherry's home. 3 months after the murder, something interesting happened. Some documents from Sherry's case disappeared from the police station. Among them were records of detectives about the progress of the investigation. They had to record almost every step related to the investigation of this crime. But at one point, the police simply could not find these journals. However, there were no important leads there anyway. Since then, the case has been hanging for years. Detectives did not show much desire to look for new leads, despite constant pressure from Sherry's parents. 8 months after the murder, Sherry's father offered a reward of $10,000 for any information that would help find the perpetrator. A year later, he held a press conference where he again promised a reward for information, but in both cases, it yielded no results. 7 years later, the lead investigator on the case retired. The victim's father decided to meet with his successor, hoping that he would take his job more seriously. Additionally, it was 1993 and DNA analysis technology was already being actively used by the police to solve crimes. Sherry's father asked the detective to perform such an analysis and even offered to fully pay for it. However, the detective stated that it was pointless since they did not have a single suspect with whom to compare the obtained DNA profile. Meanwhile, John started a new family, but at some point, he reunited with Stephanie. They planned to go to Hawaii together, but something unusual happened before that. The man called the detective and asked if they had any new evidence indicating Stephanie's involvement in the murder. Apparently, he himself suspected that the woman might have done something like that. However, all these years, he was afraid to talk about it, although this did not prevent him from sleeping with her again. As for Stephanie herself, she was quickly climbing the career ladder in the police department. She received higher ranks, twice became Detective of the Year, and had an impeccable reputation. She also married another police officer, but this did not prevent her from regularly sleeping with John. In 2001, a separate unit was formed in Los Angeles to work on unsolved murders. They were given Sherry's case along with thousands of similar cases, and the detectives began sorting through them gradually. They briefly studied each case, trying to understand which ones had the greatest chance of being solved. For example, murders without any clues were pushed to the end of the queue, and cases with DNA samples of possible suspects were marked as the most promising. Sherry's murder made it onto this list because among the evidence was a piece of cotton that could have contained the perpetrator's saliva, left behind after a bite. 2 years later, detectives picked up the case and sent all available evidence to the laboratory. Due to high demand, they had to wait almost 2 years for the results until January 2005. Among the evidence were nail fragments and blood samples from the apartment. All of them contained only Sherry's DNA, and the forensic scientists only had to study the sample from the bite mark on her body. Problem was that they couldn't find the vial with this evidence for a whole day until they finally discovered it by the wall of a large refrigerator. After studying the sample, experts found foreign DNA belonging to an unknown woman. This profile was immediately run through the FBI database, but it wasn't there. Detectives speculated that this woman could have committed the robbery with another criminal, or 2 female robbers could have broken into Sherry's apartment. The investigators still believed that the murder occurred during a robbery. Therefore, they didn't consider any other versions. After they failed to find any new leads in this direction, the case was put on hold. This continued until February 2009, when a new detective took up Sherry's case and began studying the materials left by other investigators. Seeing that DNA from another woman was found at the bite mark on the victim's body, he questioned the robbery version. Detectives considered that the motives for this crime could be completely different, so they decided to compile a list of all the women who could potentially be related to Sherry's murder. As a result, they managed to collect 5 names. Among them was Stephanie, the victim's colleague at work, and 3 other young women. The detectives initially doubted Stephanie's involvement, considering her reputation and successful career in the police. For this reason, he first decided to check the other suspects. Together with other investigators, they fairly quickly concluded that 3 women from this list had no connection to Sherry's death. They lacked motives and had alibis. After that, they began to investigate the nurse who worked with Sherry. The case file stated that they had rather tense relations, and the police secretly obtained a sample of her DNA from the trash she threw away. Experts extracted the profile and found that it didn't match the saliva found at the bite mark location. Thus, the detectives had only one suspect left: Stephanie. He and several colleagues agreed to keep this information secret until they could obtain solid evidence or disprove this theory. None of them wanted to accuse a police officer with an impeccable reputation of murder, and Stephanie could easily ruin their careers using her connections. They began secretly gathering information on her, trying to find any connection to the murder. Interestingly, the woman worked in the same building on the same floor as them. Because of this, the investigators had to take many precautions and not even mention her name in their notes. Soon, the detectives discovered the first interesting fact. During the years of the murder, Stephanie owned a .38 caliber revolver, the same type of gun that was used to shoot Sherry. They also learned that the victim had repeatedly complained about strange and even aggressive behavior from Stephanie. The fact that the police officer came to Sherry's workplace in her uniform and said rude things to her seemed suspicious. Even more suspicion was added by the fact that Stephanie had broken into Sherry's gated community and even into her apartment several times. After analyzing the reports and photos from the crime scene, the detectives concluded that the possible robbery seemed staged. Nothing was taken from the apartment, not even the valuable items that were prominently displayed, but instead only a player and stereo were taken away. Moreover, the shooter had to be well versed in how the gun worked. In extreme conditions, he was able to wrap the gun barrel with a blanket in such a way that the neighbors did not hear a single shot. It is unlikely that a low-level thief of players could possess such skills, but a trained and experienced police officer could. Another fact indicating Stephanie's involvement was a stolen marriage registration certificate found in her apartment. Why would some random burglars look for this document and take it with them, leaving a whole box of jewelry behind? But for Stephanie, it could have had a significant symbolic value. Perhaps killing Sherry was not enough for her, or she had planned to break into her apartment only for this document, but the woman caught her in the act. In the end, the detective learned that 2 weeks after the murder, Stephanie came to the police station and filed a report of theft. According to this information, someone had broken into her car, which was left near the pier, and stolen several items, including a sports bag, clothes, videotapes, and a .38 caliber revolver. Given all the facts presented, the moment with the gun seemed very suspicious. Detectives suspected that she intentionally got rid of the weapon, disguising it as a theft. Furthermore, she filed a report at a different police station where nobody knew her, which seemed very strange since her colleagues would have taken the case with the utmost responsibility. As a result, the detectives decided to obtain a DNA sample from Stephanie. Several officers undercover followed her for a week until they finally had the opportunity to get it. On May 28, 2009, Stephanie and her stepdaughter stopped at a cafe for a snack. As soon as they left, the officers took the glass she drank from and sent it to the lab. The next day, the result was ready: a full match. Despite the many factors pointing to Stephanie's involvement, the detectives were still shocked. It was hard for them to believe that a high-ranking and respected police officer was connected to the murder, but the DNA results were indisputable. However, at that moment, they did not have time for these thoughts, and investigators began developing a plan to arrest her. None of them wanted to do this in the middle of the police station, in front of hundreds of officers. Moreover, Stephanie had extensive connections, and the detectives decided to lure her away from prying eyes. The chief of the Los Angeles Police Department was unofficially informed that one of his subordinates was suspected of the murder. The chief ordered the detectives not to approach Stephanie while she had her service or personal weapon with her. He also considered the idea of arresting her in her own home risky, since she lived with her husband and stepdaughter. The detectives began to think about how to get the person who outranked them to surrender their weapon. And soon they had an excellent idea. In the basement of the police department, there were holding cells designed for temporary detention of criminals. So anyone entering there had to surrender their weapon. To lure her there, a legend was created. Stephanie had extensive experience working in the department that dealt with art thefts. Therefore, on June 5, 2009, 2 detectives with hidden microphones approached her and asked for help. They said they had arrested a suspect who may have some information about stolen paintings. The detectives admitted that they were not familiar with all the details and needed the help of an experienced professional. Stephanie agreed and went with them to the basement where the suspect was supposed to be held. After the woman surrendered her weapon, they went to the interrogation room, but there was no suspect there. Instead, the detectives gradually and very carefully laid out the cards on the table, asking Stephanie questions about Sherry's murder. At first, they simply said that they needed to ask her a few questions about an old case related to her ex-boyfriend. Over the course of an hour, They smoothly led the dialogue to a discussion of the murder itself, but Stephanie said that she hardly remembered Sherry, as it was all a long time ago. Finally, the detectives announced that they had obtained the killer's DNA and asked Stephanie to provide her DNA sample for comparison. At that point, the woman immediately said that she was not going to give her DNA, refused to talk further without a lawyer, and decided to leave. The detectives let her go, but several policemen with handcuffs were waiting for Stephanie at the end of the corridor. 23 years after the murder, the woman was arrested. Considering Stephanie's vast police experience, all attempts to talk to her during interrogations led to no results. She knew the situation perfectly. There was DNA evidence against her, found at the bite mark on the victim's body, and it was extremely difficult to dispute this evidence. Nevertheless, she denied her involvement and insisted on her innocence. As a result, the detectives had no choice but to prepare documents for the transfer to court. Over the next few years, Stephanie was held in a woman's prison until the first hearings began in 2012. It took the police 3 years to basically rebuild the case from scratch. Because their predecessors blindly believed in a failed robbery, it was necessary to redo all the materials and focus specifically on Stephanie. At the trial, the woman continued to insist on her innocence. Her lawyer questioned the DNA test results and also pointed out that there were no suspicions against Stephanie during the initial investigation. But all these arguments turned out to be completely unconvincing. The prosecution believed that on that day, Stephanie waited for John to leave for work and entered Sherry's apartment. She went upstairs, shot Sherry once, but Sherry managed to resist and a struggle ensued, which moved downstairs. Ultimately, Stephanie killed her, staged a riot in the apartment, creating an illusion of a burglary. She then found a marriage certificate and left the scene. After her arrest, detectives discovered that Stephanie had boasted to colleagues about her lock-picking set, and they found several books on how to pick locks in her home. This could explain how she entered the apartment without leaving any traces of a break-in. A lock of not the best quality can be picked with lockpicks so that no expert will notice any traces. The trial ended on March 8, 2012, and the jury found Stephanie guilty of murder. She received a sentence ranging from 27 years to life in prison, as well as an additional 2 years for using a service weapon. The judge deducted 1,000 days from her sentence, citing the time spent behind bars awaiting trial and her good behavior. Sherry's parents tried to sue the detectives who originally worked the case, despite the fact that the victim's father had been telling them to look at Stephanie from the very beginning. They ignored his words. This raises a reasonable question. Were they deliberately covering up their colleague, or did they really not believe in her involvement? In the first case, it would have been a serious crime, and in the second case, it would have been simple negligence and ignoring significant facts. Unfortunately, the statute of limitations had expired in this case, and the court refused to prosecute these police officers. As for Stephanie, she filed an appeal immediately after the trial, but it was quickly rejected. She still denies her guilt while behind bars. At present, she's 62 years old and can file a petition for early release only in 2039. Sherry's ex-husband, John, lost interest in investigating her murder. Almost immediately after it happened, he started a new family, slept with Stephanie for a while, and later moved to another city. Detectives questioned his involvement, but this version seems unlikely. Most likely, he did not know about his ex-wife's plans. Thus, this case could have been gathering dust in archives to this day if it hadn't fallen into the hands of professional detectives. Everyone who worked on it before refused to even consider the version of their colleagues' involvement. Samantha Koenig was born August 30th, 1993 in Anchorage, Alaska. The state's largest population center is characterized by a quiet, measured lifestyle, a harsh climate, and vast expanses surrounded by snow-capped mountains. The girl loved animals very much, so after school she planned to find a job related to them. Another option for her was a career as a doctor. Samantha even considered applying to the Navy as a nurse. In her spare time, she worked part-time at a Subway restaurant and a Harley-Davidson dealership. In early 2012, when she was 18, she found another part-time job at a small chain coffee shop downtown. Samantha was excited about the opportunity. First of all, the job was easy enough. Secondly, she had to be alone on her shift, so the whole work process depended solely on her. Her boyfriend, however, did not share this enthusiasm. He was worried about Samantha having to work through the night alone and tried to talk her out of it. But eventually, he supported her decision on the condition that he would pick her up after each shift. She assured him that the coffee shop was full of cameras and even had a panic button to call the police. Even though the coffee shop was in the middle of nowhere, it was a fairly deserted area, like most of Anchorage. The city has low population density, so even in the downtown area, you can see empty streets. Also, the daylight hours are short in winter in Alaska, so Samantha had to work a lot during the hours of darkness. Samantha fell in love with the job and quickly got the hang of it. By early February, she had already worked there for a month, and on the first of the month, she was getting ready to finish her shift at 8 p.m. as usual. A customer came out 5 minutes before the coffee shop closed and ordered a large Americano. Samantha prepared the drink and turned to the window to give it to the customer. He took the glass and immediately pointed a gun at the young woman. An unidentified man in a ski mask stated that he was going to rob her and demanded that the lights in the coffee shop be turned off. Samantha complied, and the offender immediately broke in through the window. A surveillance camera caught the whole thing, but those silent witnesses could not help her. Frightened by the armed robber, she also did not press the panic button. Once inside the coffee shop, the perpetrator tied Samantha up and asked where her car was parked. The young woman replied that she didn't have one and added that her boyfriend would be here any minute to pick her up. The man then took her outside and headed for his car. While he was looking around, Samantha managed to break free and ran, but the perpetrator quickly caught up with her and grabbed her. Unfortunately, there was not a soul on the street at the time, so no one could help her. The man said that if she tried to run away again, he would kill her. He then led the young woman across the street to his pickup truck and put her in the passenger seat. The perpetrator had obviously prepared in advance, since the license plates had been taken off the car. As he drove her to an unknown destination, the man stated that he only wanted a ransom from her family and that Samantha could then go home. He still did not show her his face, which was concealed by a ski mask. All along the way, the young woman tried to convince him to let her go and told him that her family didn't have much money, but the kidnapper wouldn't listen. At one point, he asked Samantha where her phone was. The young woman replied that she had left it in a coffee shop, and this enraged the perpetrator. He needed the phone for his ransom plan. So he went back to the coffee shop to get the smartphone and sent 2 messages from it to Samantha's boss and to her boyfriend. In them, the kidnapper wrote on the young woman's behalf that she was tired and would go out of town with friends for a few days. All the while, Samantha was in his pickup truck. After texting, the kidnapper removed the battery from the phone and got behind the wheel again. He drove the young woman to an undisclosed location that looked like a barn and told her to sit quietly. The man stated that if she tried to scream, he would kill her. He also added that he had a police scanner, and if she somehow managed to call for help, he would know right away. The perpetrator demanded Samantha's credit card, but things were not so simple here. The young woman said she shared a bank account with her boyfriend, and the card was in his possession. So the man decided to steal it. Having first learned the boyfriend's address and PIN number, he left the tied-up Samantha alone and went to get the card. The young woman told him it was always in the guy's car. Once there, the perpetrator saw the right car and started breaking it open. At that very moment, the guy spotted it from the window and rushed outside, but he was too late. The kidnapper took out the card and quickly fled. On the way back, he stopped at an ATM to check the PIN number, then returned to Samantha's house. Meanwhile, the young woman's relatives and boyfriend were in a panic. The guy didn't believe for a second that the message was written to her, and everyone understood that something bad had happened to Samantha. But at that moment, none of them connected the theft of the credit card with the disappearance of the young woman. The guy didn't even think the events could be connected in any way. By nightfall, Samantha's family contacted the police and they began a search. Of course, the first thing they did was to look through the camera footage in the coffee shop and immediately witnessed her abduction. Soon the FBI got involved, but they could not find any serious leads. The perpetrator had clearly prepared carefully for the kidnapping. Not a single detail that could be used to identify him was caught on camera. Meanwhile, the young woman's relatives, with the help of concerned people, raised the $41,000 they had promised for information on Samantha's whereabouts. The parents were constantly being interviewed by local TV stations, begging for any information about their daughter's fate. Flyers with Samantha's picture and information about the reward appeared all over Anchorage, but the police never received a single valuable witness. As the days passed, detectives desperate for answers began checking everyone Samantha knew, including her boyfriend and relatives, but they quickly determined that none of them had anything to do with the kidnapping. Nearly a month passed. On February 24, Samantha's boyfriend received a new message from her number saying, "Connor, park sign, under Albert's picture. Isn't she cute?" Investigators immediately realized it was about the local Connor's dog park and, along with the young woman's relatives, headed there. After a while, they saw what the kidnapper meant. There was a booth in the park with various flyers, among which was a photo of a dead dog named Albert. The owners placed this flyer on the stand to say goodbye to their pet, but the detectives noticed a plastic bag underneath it. When they opened it, they saw a Polaroid photo of Samantha in the background with a newspaper from February 13 and a letter written on a typewriter in which the kidnapper demanded that $30,000 be deposited in her bank account. He promised to kill the young woman if these conditions were not met. The police and the FBI immediately devised a plan that could help them catch this thoughtful criminal. They told the young woman's father to top up the card in installments so that the kidnapper would have to repeatedly go to the ATMs. He did just that. First, the man deposited $5,000, and a few hours later, that money was withdrawn from one of the Anchorage ATMs. The kidnapper was caught on camera, but even here, the detectives were unsuccessful. The man was wearing a hat, a hood, glasses, and what appeared to be a false beard and mustache. It was impossible to identify him from the photograph. The police immediately arrived at the ATM, but the perpetrator had already fled. A week later, the thief withdrew another batch of money in Willcox, Arizona, the opposite end of the United States. He traveled 6,000 miles to throw off investigators, but they continued to monitor his activities. The next cash withdrawal occurred in Lordsburg, New Mexico, just an hour away from Arizona. Following that, he made 2 more withdrawals in different cities in Texas. In the meantime, police carefully examined ATM photos. They soon realized that the criminal had made a huge mistake in Willcox. He had left his car in the camera's line of sight, so the detectives now knew the model of his car. Of course, it was impossible to make out the license plates in such a picture, but now they had something to work with. Investigators feared the kidnapper might cross the border into Mexico, so all patrols were instructed to stop white Ford Focuses. A few days later, on March 13, a Texas Highway Patrol spotted a vehicle of that make in a hotel parking lot. There was a man sitting behind the wheel. The officer decided to wait for him to pull up and follow him. Soon the man drove out of the parking lot and along the highway. As soon as the driver exceeded the allowable speed limit of 3 miles, the patrolman ordered him to pull over at the curb. This was done to put the suspect's vigilance to sleep. If a dangerous criminal is behind the wheel, he may be armed and ready to fight back to the last man. So the patrolman pretended that the reason for the stop was a minor infraction. The driver of the white Ford turned out to be 34-year-old Israel Keys of Anchorage. The policeman was immediately alerted and decided to search his car, calling for backup in the process. Samantha's cell phone and her boyfriend's bank card were found in the car. They also found a gun, a false mustache, a beard, and dark glasses, Police had no doubt that he was behind Samantha's kidnapping, but they were still shocked because Keyes had never come to their attention. The man had a perfectly clean criminal history. He lived with his girlfriend and 10-year-old daughter and ran his small construction business successfully. He was respected and trusted among his acquaintances. Even some members of the Anchorage prosecutor's office used his repair and construction services. But one question preoccupied everyone. Where was Samantha Gaining? Under questioning, Keyes was extremely calm. He joked and laughed a lot. The FBI agents kept up the dialogue in his style, and after a while he confessed what he had done. Keyes stated that he had been planning to rob this coffee shop for several days. He did not know in advance if he would kidnap the employee. Moreover, he had worked out 2 rules which he himself broke: never look for victims near his own home, and never transport them in his car. All of this made him hesitant as he stood in front of Samantha in a dark coffee shop. But he made the decision to act to the end. On the night of the kidnapping, he drove her to the shed in the backyard of his house, where his daughter and girlfriend were at the time. The perpetrator turned on the radio in case his victim tried to scream, and left to get the bank card. When he returned, Israel quietly entered the house, trying not to wake his family, poured himself a glass of wine, and went into the barn. There, he abused Samantha and killed her. But what about this photo they found in the park? It had the February 13th issue of the newspaper from 2 weeks after the kidnapping, and Samantha appeared to be alive. But in fact, she had been dead all along, and there is no manipulation in the photo. Keyes fixed her eyelids so that her eyes were open and applied makeup to her face. According to a detective who attended the interrogation, Israel recounted the details of the murder with such ease as if he were listing the foods he had eaten for breakfast. The perpetrator agreed to tell it all on the condition that the confession portion of the interrogation not be published. He did not want his daughter to hear it all. In doing so, he killed Samantha only a few dozen yards from her bedroom. The detectives already thought Keyes' story was nearing its end, but that was only the beginning. The morning after the murder, Israel and his family went on a sea cruise from the city of New Orleans. Tickets for it had been purchased in advance, and the perpetrator was well aware that he was committing this murder just hours before departure. Accordingly, he had to leave the body somewhere so that no one would discover it. Keyes did the simple thing and left it in the same barn. It was freezing outside, so the body quickly froze. When Keyes returned home 2 weeks later, he took a picture with a newspaper and used a typewriter to write a ransom letter. He then separated the body into pieces and went to a small lake 40 minutes outside Anchorage. Using a chainsaw, he made holes in the ice where he placed bags of the body parts and additional weights. After all that, the maniac went winter fishing. It took police divers 10 hours to retrieve those bags from the bottom. Detectives also learned that during his trips between ATMs across the states, Keyes used a rental car, the same white Ford Focus. At one point, he had a malfunction and went to one of the dealerships to have the car changed. Surprisingly, that moment played a key role in catching the culprit. The car was caught on ATM camera before the breakdown, and all the police were looking for that particular model. The dealership gave him the same white Focus because they had no other suitable cars at the time. Had the situation been different, he would never have been stopped. In the end, during questioning, Keyes confirmed what the investigators had already guessed. Samantha was not his first victim. The perpetrator had promised to tell them about all the crimes he had committed in exchange for 2 conditions. First, he wanted a guaranteed death sentence and demanded that it be carried out within a year of being pronounced. Second, he asked that everything he said be kept secret from the press. These conditions surprised the detectives, but they saw no reason to refuse, and the maniac began to tell them horror stories. Israel began committing crimes at an early age. He would break into other people's houses, steal, set fires in the woods, and torture animals. His parents were deep believers, but they practiced a very questionable and unpopular branch of Christianity. Because of his parents' constantly shifting religious preferences, They regularly moved around the country. At the age of 20, Keyes joined the Army, where he spent 3 years. A few months before that, he had molested a random young woman after spotting her in an Oregon park. When questioned, Israel said he wanted to get out of the Army as soon as possible so he could start killing. After quitting at age 23, he began his killing streak. Keyes made weapons caches in the woods so he could go there at any time and start looking for victims. Police found 2 such caches in Anchorage and New York. Inside were money, knives, gun, and body disposal supplies. Over the next few years, he regularly went out hunting in different states, but the exact number of his victims is still unknown. The FBI has only been able to pinpoint 5 of them. But detectives believe Keyes committed at least 11 murders, and these are just the cases where many factors point to his involvement. In total, the number of murders could be as many as 30. In addition, Israel had been robbing banks, stores, and private homes so that he always had enough money to buy weapons and travel. In his hiding places, discovered after interrogations, he was found to have considerable cash reserves. Despite all this, the man has never come to the attention of the police, except on one occasion. In all interrogations, he denied his involvement, but detectives did not believe him. On March 3, 1996, a 12-year-old girl named Julie Harris disappeared. Israel Keyes, who was 16 at the time, lived in the same neighborhood. Police suspected him after a witness found Julie near Keyes shortly before her disappearance. It was not until a year later that the girl's remains were found in the river, and her killer was never caught. During interrogations after Samantha's murder, Keyes denied his involvement, but investigators were again reluctant to take his word for it. They did not, however, have any direct evidence. In a conversation with FBI agents, Israel admitted that he had studied serial killers since he was a child. His idol was Ted Bundy, and the maniac wanted to be like him. He felt no remorse for his victims and happily recounted how he managed to lead 2 completely different lives. On the one hand, he was a decent family man and businessman, and on the other, he was an inhuman killer. The only thing that gave any hint of feeling was that Keyes had asked the detectives to keep the details of his crimes from his daughter. He also stated that he had never killed children or anyone who had, again because of his own daughter. The FBI agents did not believe this, but they could not prove otherwise. They were all forced to admit that Israel was an extremely thoughtful maniac who had made only one mistake in his entire series of crimes. The investigators hoped that he would tell them all of his atrocities himself, but that never happened. 9 months after his arrest, Keyes took his own life in his cell. Even though FBI agents had spent hundreds of hours interrogating him up to that point, much he had withheld from them. 11 drawings depicting skulls were found under the bed in his cell. It is possible that each one symbolized a victim. The picture of these drawings were not published until 2020. Thus, Israel Keyes can be considered one of the most violent and elaborate maniacs. He managed to maintain an impeccable reputation, committing dozens of different crimes, always getting away with it. If he hadn't left his car in camera view, he might never have been caught. Investigators had no doubt that if he had, he would have continued to kill. Keyes himself said he saw killing as his purpose in life and planned to continue hunting people until he was caught. Rachel Jane Nichol was born on November 23, 1968, in a village near Colchester, England. She grew up in a decent, full family. Her father was an army officer and her mother a housewife. From an early age, the young woman took part in various volunteer programs, helping the elderly and children with disabilities. At age 11, she enrolled at Colchester High School for Girls, where she was active in dance, singing, and acting. All of her teachers insisted that the young woman had real talent and should develop in that direction. However, Rachel herself was more deeply into the study of history and English. After school, she got a job as a lifeguard at the pool in Richmond. Rachel later planned to try her hand at hosting a television program for children. In 1988, when she was 20 years old, Rachel met her future husband, Andre. The couple began dating, and a year later they had a son, Alex. Together they moved to an area of London called Thelham. By then, she had already been offered a job as a model, but she decided to devote her full attention to her family for a few years and then try to get a job in television. On a summer morning, July 15, 1992, Rachel took her son and their Labrador for a walk in the local park. At the time, Alex was only a month away from his 3rd birthday. This park in Wimbledon Common neighborhood was popular with the locals. There were always a lot of people there during the daytime, mostly parents with children and dog walkers. Despite this, because of the large area and the abundance of greenery, it was always possible to get away from prying eyes and enjoy nature in solitude. Unfortunately, there was a downside to this. At about 10:30 a.m., a woman walking in the park noticed a gruesome scene. A young woman was lying on the ground. There was a lot of blood around, and a small child was sitting next to her. The victim was Rachel. Several dozen police officers arrived on the scene. They had to cordon off an area of 4 square kilometers where there were hundreds of potential witnesses and possibly the killer. Detectives soon realized that none of the park's visitors had seen either the moment of the attack or the killer himself. No one, except for one witness, Rachel's son, Alex. They were to get all the information from the 2-year-old boy. Of course, this was extremely difficult to do. The child was first admitted to the hospital for examination to make sure he was not injured. Later, the detectives did get some information from him. He said he and his mother were approached by a tall, thin, white man with brown hair. Everyone in that park was questioned. It took the police almost an entire day, but it only took a few hours for reporters to get the whole country to hear about this gruesome crime. Rachel's case instantly caused a wide resonance, which is not surprising. A young mother died in front of her child in one of the most popular parks in London. Residents of Britain were even more shocked when the newspapers leaked information from the pathologist's report. Rachel had been stabbed 49 times with a sharp object. There was enormous pressure on the Metropolitan Police. Society demanded that the sadist be caught and punished as quickly as possible, and detectives did indeed have to work at an accelerated pace. In the first few weeks, they interviewed 548 men, 32 of whom were even arrested for a short period of time, but all to no avail. The police simply had no leads. The only thing the experts were able to find was a tiny piece of organic material that they thought might be connected to the killer, but 1992 technology simply didn't allow them to study it. By September, investigators were left with no suspects, so they enlisted the help of Paul Britton, a renowned profiler, to compile a description of the killer. Here's what he came up with. He is a man in his late 20s to early 30s, most likely living alone. All of his hobbies are also socially unrelated. He's interested in knives and the occult and has sadistic fantasies. In addition, he lives near the park. At the request of the police department, this profile, along with the sketch, was shown on television. After that, they received at least 4 calls, all with the same matching name, Colin Francis Stagg. In addition to the fact that he fit the sketch, the police ran his name and realized that he had already been on their radar. The fact is that Stagg had tried to enter the park the day Rachel was killed. Colin Stagg, 27, had led a secluded lifestyle. He had lost his job and was struggling to find money to pay for housing and food. He had a dog that he walked every morning in Wimbledon Common Park. According to his testimony, on the day Rachel was killed, he went there with his dog, but because of a severe headache, he quickly went home and went to bed. Toward evening, he felt better and decided to take his dog out for a walk again. However, on this approach to the park, he was stopped by the police. Stagg calmly answered all questions and gave his details. The police had no evidence against Stagg, but he seemed to them to be a suitable candidate for the role of the killer. In addition, the press kept pressuring law enforcement agencies, and they needed a breakthrough in the case urgently. That same day, Stagg was brought to the police station, where he was held for 3 days. When questioned, He denied any involvement in the murder, but the detectives were beginning to believe more and more the opposite. First, occult books were found in his home, which coincided with the profiler's suggestion. Second, the police were able to find two women who gave some disturbing details about Stagg. One woman accused him of exposing himself in front of her in that very park. In his defense, Collins said he was just sunbathing in a secluded part of the park and the woman came there herself. Another woman reported that she had been exchanging intimate letters with him for some time. In one of them, he confessed to her that he dreamed of having sexual intercourse outdoors. All this was already enough for the police to consider Colin a pervert and finally believe his involvement in the murder of Rachel. Except they knew that all these circumstantial arguments would not stand a chance in court. For this reason, the man had to be released. On the advice of his lawyer, he agreed to pay a fine for exposing himself to a woman in the park, though he continued to insist on his innocence. Detectives, along with a profiler, came up with a very unusual plan that was supposed to help force a confession. A Metropolitan Police officer, under the pseudonym Lacey James, began writing Colin letters of intimate content. She said she knew the woman Stagg had corresponded with before. Despite the ridiculousness of the situation, the plan worked. Colin responded to all the letters, and each time their dialogues became more and more explicit and perverted. Lizzie played the part of a woman with violent and sadist hobbies, sometimes even illegal, and their communication lasted 5 months. All this time, Stagg insisted that they finally meet in person, and the detectives decided it might actually help to get a confession out. The location and date was set at a park. Lizzie didn't go there alone, but Stagg didn't know that. Plainclothes officers were keeping an eye on them in case the man decided to attack their colleague. During the conversation, Lizzie, on the provider's advice, shared with Colin a fictional story about her secret hobbies. She revealed that her ex-boyfriend was into the occult and that they performed a ritual sacrifice on a living person together. Stagg took this information rather calmly. At least he kept in touch with Lizzie, and they spent a few more hours together and parted ways. After that, they met a few more times, and finally, the police decided to move on to the final part. Walking in the park, Lizzie talked to Colin about Rachel's murder. She told him that she wished he had been the murderer because she was aroused by thoughts of the crime, but it didn't work. Stagg apologized to her and told her that he had nothing to do with the murder. Lizzie tried to get him to confess several more times, but he kept denying his involvement. It looked as if the police had botched a 6-month operation. They couldn't get any evidence that Stagg had killed Rachel, but the detectives were still convinced they were right. That's why they did arrest him in August 1993. At the interrogation, Colin was told all the cards and that all this time he had been in correspondence with a police officer. He was read excerpts from these letters describing various perversions and was also introduced to the real Lizzie herself. Stagg was shocked, but on the advice of his lawyer, refused to answer police questions. Investigators had hoped to the last that under such pressure he would confess to the murder, but he did not. All they had to do now was to take the case to trial. All this dragged on for a year, which Stagg spent in custody. When the case finally went to trial, his lawyers blew the prosecution's arguments to smithereens. Even the judge was forced to admit that the whole operation with Lizzie James was overkill and that the police had behaved in an extremely unprofessional manner. In September 1994, Colin was acquitted of all charges and released. Lizzie James later resigned from the police, citing serious psychological trauma from the operation. The police, who had spent more than £3 million on this investigation, were deadlocked. They had not a single suspect, and most of the detectives continued to think that Stagg was the murderer, and they were not alone in this opinion. The newspapers and the public continued to blame him for what happened. Every time he went out on the street, he caught the embittered looks of passerby. Almost the entire country believed that the murderer had gotten away with it, and this only added to the hatred towards Stagg. This went on for years. The Rachel Nichol case was finally hung in the balance, and the police made little effort to look for new suspects. Why, when they were all sure of Colin's involvement? By then, Rachel's husband, along with Alex, had gone to live in Europe for several reasons. First, he was constantly harassed by journalists, which reminded his son of his mother's murder. Secondly, the father felt it was not safe for his son to remain in London. He was the only person who saw the murderer. For a long time, no one knew which country they had moved to. Later, journalists did get wind that they lived in Spain and France. In 2000, Scotland Yard took up the case and assigned a new team to it. They studied all the collected material and witness statements, but they failed to find a new suspect. Only 3 years later, they announced that they had found DNA from an unknown man on Rachel's clothes. Analysis technology had only just matured to such a capability, and in 1992, such a discovery was simply impossible. Even in 2003, this tiny sample, which took experts 18 months to find, was not enough to establish identity. The data from that sample was only enough to rule out unsuitable people. And a year later, in 2004, the police finally had a new suspect. His DNA was already in the database, and a comparison with a sample from Rachel's clothes showed mixed results. That man was the 38-year-old Robert Napper, a convicted murderer and serial rapist who, at the time, had already spent 10 years in a halfway house. His biography is striking in two ways: the cruelty of his crimes and the ease with which he evaded justice. Later, because of this, the police would face a wave of outrage from the public. Napper first came into the hands of law enforcement in 1986. He was then given a suspended sentence for assault with an air gun. In 1989, he broke into a young mother's house and abused her. For the next 4 years, there was a series of similar attacks, but the police did not tie them together and could not reach the suspect. What followed was something truly amazing. Napper confessed to his mother that he had carried out all these attacks. She called the police and told them everything. And what do you think? They found no connection between the crimes and the woman's story, so they didn't look into Napper's involvement. The only thing the mother could do was convince her son to see a psychiatrist. When Napper came back from there, he said that the specialist thought he was crazy, but took no further action. A short time later, he assaulted and abused a woman and her child in Crystal Palace Park. This happened just weeks before Rachel's murder, but again, the police failed to see the connection. This was by no means the only such attack in Crystal Palace Park, and police at some point figured out that one man was committing the crimes. From the words of witnesses, they compiled a sketch of him. After the publication in the newspapers, several of Napper's neighbors contacted the detectives. They all pointed to the man, and the police called Napper for a blood sample. He simply ignored the request, and the detectives did not go looking for him. They simply forgot about him. In November 1993, London was rocked by another high-profile crime, which, as it later turned out, was also committed by Napper. A young mother, Samantha Bissett, was attacked in her room. In addition, the perpetrator did not spare her young daughter. What he did to them shocked even experienced detectives. The police photographer who arrived on the scene could not return to work for several months because of the shock of what he saw. Remarkably, the same profiler who had been brought in to investigate Rachel's murder worked on all of these cases, and he believed that all of these attacks had nothing to do with each other. The detectives also saw no possible connection to the Rachel case because they were 100% sure that Colin Stagg was guilty. The team of investigators handling the attack at Crystal Palace Park also saw no connection. Napper was nearly 190 centimeters tall, and based on witness testimony, the perpetrator was shorter. But the maniac made one mistake in the attack on Samantha Bissett. He left a fingerprint in her apartment that allowed his identity to be run through the database. Napper had previously been fingerprinted after he stalked a woman in the street. He was not arrested until May 1994. When questioned, he denied guilt and was extremely calm. In his apartment, they found maps of London on which the locations of the attacks and murders were circled, including the place where Rachel was murdered. They also found several notes on how to properly abuse women. Shortly before that, police found a knife in the very park where Rachel was murdered. The fingerprints on the handle matched Napper's, but even that wasn't enough to make detectives consider him for the killer, because they were still convinced Colin Stagg was guilty. Napper, however, was still considered a suspect in Rachel's murder for a while, but those charges were quickly dropped. The thing is that Napper said he was at work that day. In 1995, Napper went on trial for the murder of Samantha and her daughter. The prosecution struck a deal with him in which he pleaded guilty to manslaughter, and the court sent him to a closed psychiatric hospital instead of prison. The fact was that Napper had been diagnosed with a number of disorders, including Asperger's syndrome and schizophrenia. Because of this, the maniac could have avoided prison anyway, with or without a confession. As a result, the judge sent him to Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital for treatment, with no time limit. Later, detectives wanted to question him about Rachel's murder, but the doctors forbade it. They feared it might aggravate Napper's mental status. Back to 2004, the new team of detectives on the Rachel Nichol case finally began to take a closer look at Napper as a suspect. After they compared his DNA to a small sample found on the young woman's body, the results were very mixed. That sample wasn't enough to confirm the similarity. It was only enough to rule out other suspects. In Napper's case, the results did not do with 100% certainty. Investigators kept digging further using new technology. On Rachel's clothing, they managed to spot a microscopic piece of paint. Experts examined it and concluded that it matched the paint on Napper's iron toolbox. Prior to his arrest, he worked as a storekeeper for the Department of Defense. It is not entirely clear how he could have gotten a job there with his set of mental disorders, but the fact remains, he combined assault and murder with his day job. It took Scotland Yard 3 years to prepare this case for trial, and in 2007, Napper was charged with the murder of Rachel Nichol. During the first hearing, he pleaded not guilty, which prolonged the trial for almost a year. In the end, Napper agreed the same deal he had been offered 12 years earlier, a change of plea to manslaughter in exchange for a confession. On December 18, 2008, 16 years after the murder, he finally confessed. For Napper himself, the verdict did not change anything. He was left in the same hospital under heavy guard. Most likely, he will never be released, but the news made a lot of noise all over Britain. The police suffered the most, fixating on Colin Stagg and completely ignoring on Colin Stagg and other serious leads. Instead, the investigation was divided into 3 separate lines. Each team of detectives looked for different criminals, while behind all the attacks and murders was Napper. That same year, 2008, Stagg sued the police department for £706,000, a record for Britain for unwarranted criminal prosecutions. The Metropolitan Police also issued a public apology to him. He subsequently wrote several books about his life experiences. In them, he described what it was like to be accused of murder. Stagg admitted that for 10 years, his life was effectively ruined by journalists and the police. After the whole of Britain finally believed in his innocence, he decided to spend all the compensation on travel, expensive cars, and other things that brought him joy. In 2010, a special commission issued a report criticizing the actions of homicide detectives. This document was called a catalog of wrong decisions and mistakes. And the reason for this is not only the fact that the murder could not be solved for 16 years. The whole point is that if the police had done their job properly, they could have arrested Napper before he killed Rachel, Samantha, and her daughter. No disciplinary action followed, however. All of the detectives involved in the case retired, and one of the lead investigators passed away. As for Rachel's son, Alex, he did not give his first interview until 2017, 25 years after the incident. He said that growing up without his mother had been problematic, but that he had found the strength to let go and move on. Shortly before the interview, he went to the very place where his mother was murdered, and in that moment, he was able to finally let go of the heavy weight of the past. One can only hope that this story, like others like it, will serve as a lesson for law enforcement agencies around the world. It is too late to speculate about whether or not the police could have saved Rachel and Samantha, but it is never too late to draw conclusions and prevent future crimes. Shannon Melendi was born on October 20th, 1974, in Miami, USA. 5 years later, her parents had a second daughter, Monique. From an early age, the girls were taught that their first priority should be to get a quality education. This approach has had a strong influence on Shannon. From the first years of school, she studied only on the excellent, while finding time for various clubs and sections where she was also ahead of her classmates in all respects. In high school, the young woman firmly decided that she wanted to tie her future career with politics or law. She headed the school debate club, and in her last year of school, she even made a speech to the U.S. Congress and the General Assembly of the United Nations as part of special training programs. It was after these events that she finally decided she wanted to work on the Supreme Court. To achieve this goal, she needed a good legal education, and Shannon sent applications to several of the country's top universities. Given her impeccable grades and accomplishments in extracurricular activities, all universities and colleges were willing to accept her, but she chose Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. In addition to the fact that it was one of the top 20 universities in the country, the young woman was offered an annual grant of $15,000 for the first 4 years of study. That way she could cover most of her tuition. After graduation, she moved to Atlanta to study political science. The university made a great impression on her. She quickly settled in and made many friends. Despite the grant that Shannon received, she also got a part-time job. A few kilometers from her dorm was a softball field that needed employees. Her duties included keeping an eye on the score of the game. On March 26, 1994, Shannon had to quit her job because of an error by her supervisor. That morning, another employee was supposed to keep score, but the young woman was accidentally added to the schedule and agreed to work the game. Shannon arrived at the stadium at about 8:40, and 4 hours later her shift was over. Usually after work, the young woman would stop at a gas station nearby to buy a soda. That day she left as well, only no one saw her again. The stadium management expected her to return after halftime to turn in her scorecard, but she never did. Her friend and roommate, Athena, was the first to sound the alarm. At first, she was alarmed when Shannon didn't return to her dorm in the evening. She had nowhere else to sleep and was unlikely to stay with anyone. After not waiting for her roommate the next morning, she decided to call her parents to see if she had contacted them in the last 24 hours. Shannon's parents were at work at the time, so her younger sister came to the phone. She told Athena that she hadn't spoken to Shannon in the past few days and promised to ask her parents when they got home. Athena became increasingly worried and told two mutual friends about the young woman's disappearance. Then they decided to look for her on their own. They got in their car and started to drive around the campus. Eventually, they reached the stadium where Shannon worked, and there, a disturbing discovery awaited them. As they approached, they noticed a gas station near the stadium and, to their surprise, spotted Shannon's car there. It was a black Nissan 280SX that her parents had given her. As they pulled up to the gas station, the friends found the car empty, but the keys were in the ignition and the doors were unlocked. All this only increased their anxiety. Shannon would never leave her car, much less with the keys and the doors open. Ever since her parents had given her this car, she had cared for it reverently. Realizing that something terrible might have happened to the young woman, her friends called the police. Only the officers who arrived on the scene treated the situation as irresponsible as possible. They took a cursory look at the car and concluded that there was no evidence of a possible crime. There was no blood or signs of struggle in the car, so the officers simply advised their friends not to worry. They didn't even take fingerprints off the steering wheel and doors. Moreover, they asked Athena to take the car to the university parking lot, which she did. The officers talked to the gas station attendants and they confirmed that they had seen Shannon around noon yesterday. They also did not notice anything suspicious. Ultimately, the official police version was that, given there was no signs of blood or struggle in the car, Shannon had probably just run away somewhere. Given that she was 19 years old at the time, no one was going to seriously investigate the case. That evening, Shannon's parents decided to go immediately to Atlanta to participate in the search. Upon learning that the police were unwilling to investigate their daughter's disappearance, they did everything they could to change that, and in many ways it worked, thanks to Shannon herself. After she spoke to Congress, the young woman was accepted into a nonprofit organization by Jimmy Carter, the former president of the United States. Shannon's parents brought it to his attention that their daughter was missing, and he, along with Senator Bob Graham, secured FBI involvement in the case. The parents flew to Atlanta and began a search for their daughter. Along with other students, they printed and posted thousands of flyers about Shannon's disappearance, and, a little later, her father rented a billboard. Along with this, he announced a reward of $10,000 for any information that would help find the young woman. Detectives identified several suspects among Shannon's acquaintances, but quickly became convinced of their innocence. 3 days after the young woman disappeared, something interesting happened. An unidentified man called the police on the hotline number listed on the flyers about Shannon's disappearance. He stated that the reporters had made a mistake in reporting on the young woman's disappearance. They said that Shannon was wearing green shorts the day she disappeared, but that they were actually blue. Further, the caller stated that he had Shannon and was going to hold her as long as he wanted. There is one very confusing point with this call, and that is, why wasn't it given any weight? Despite the caller saying that he had kidnapped Shannon, law enforcement continued to believe that the young woman had run off somewhere. This went on for several more days until an unidentified man made a second call on April 6th. This time, he called the university's counseling center and said that Shannon was at his place and that she was fine. He promised to call later to make demands for her return. Finally, he said he would leave Shannon's ring for the police near where he was calling from to confirm his words. This time, the FBI quickly traced the call and found that it was made from a payphone located near a Burger King restaurant in suburban Atlanta. Upon arriving at the location, detectives did find the ring there in a cloth baggie that was wrapped in duct tape. Shannon's parents confirmed that the ring did indeed belong to her. For them, this news was a relief in the first place because they got a chance to see their daughter alive again. Since then, they have been waiting for the perpetrator to call again and make his demands. This event also led to law enforcement finally reclassifying the disappearance case as a kidnapping. The police department appointed a new lead detective, and he immediately noted the unprofessionalism of his predecessors. According to him, almost all of their actions were flawed. They did not take fingerprints from Shannon's car, instead asking a stranger to drive the car to another location. They also did little or nothing to investigate the case, since they thought the young woman had simply run off somewhere and would be back soon. With all this in mind, investigators decided to work every possible lead from scratch, and the first thing they focused on was the softball field where Shannon was last seen the day she disappeared. Complicating the situation was the fact that by then, several weeks had passed since the young woman had gone missing. In addition, there was a championship game on the field that day, which brought the total number of visitors and participants to over several hundred. The detectives attempted to question as many people as possible, urging them to recall any suspicious moments at the game. To their surprise, many told the same story. The only oddity at that game was the behavior of the referee. According to the players and stadium staff, he was extremely dismissive of his job. He was distracted all the time, including during key events. Instead of doing his job, he was constantly trying to talk to Shannon and ask her out. The judge's name was Colvin Hitton, but he himself preferred to use the nickname Butch. The 33-year-old man worked as a mechanic for the local Delta Airlines, while refereeing matches was his hobby. He had a wife, taught Sunday school at the church, and seemed quite harmless. The detectives began to dig deeper and discovered that Butch had left the softball field at almost the same time as Shannon. After talking to his coworkers, they found out another strange thing. The day before the game, he had asked the other umpires to fill in for him at that game because he was supposed to have a date that day. They all knew that Butch was married, but he stated that his wife was out of town for a few days. When all his coworkers said no, he called his boss and asked him to leave the game early. The man explained that his brother's wife was in the hospital and they had no one to leave the children with. Except that day, Butch returned to the stadium 2 hours after he had left and was still wearing his officiating uniform. He went into the locker room, changed, and left. 3 hours later, he returned to the stadium where he was spotted by a colleague. When asked what he was doing there, Butch said he had forgotten to give his paycheck to the accounting department, but he didn't have his paycheck with him. Moreover, Butch asked his colleague if he had seen where his car was parked. For a man who had just arrived at the stadium, that question sounded very strange. Investigators questioned Butch, and he denied any involvement in the young woman's disappearance. According to him, after the club, he went straight home. As proof, he showed detectives several outgoing calls from his phone made less than 40 minutes after leaving the stadium. He was offered a polygraph interview. Butch agreed and failed it. Almost all of the answers were deemed false, but it wasn't enough to arrest him. It was, however, enough to obtain a search warrant for his house, which, incidentally, was located near the burger joint where the police found the Shannon ring. Detectives discovered 2 other curious facts. Butch's neighbors said that he had lit a fire in the early morning hours after the day Shannon disappeared. Later, the man called his father and asked him for a handsaw, stating that a tree had fallen on his car. Detectives went to his house with their service dogs, but they were unable to find any sign of Shannon's presence there. But an interesting discovery awaited them on the property. They noticed 3 places with overgrown soil. When they dug them up, they found something really creepy. Under the ground were dozens of items of women's clothing and shoes, as well as a sleeping bag and some softball field scorecards. Experts examined the excavated clothing, showed pictures to Shannon's parents, and concluded that none of it belonged to the young woman. Butch himself said he had no idea where on his property such hiding places came from. He assumed it was all left over from the past owners of the house. In the end, the police were in a tricky situation. A lot of facts pointed to Butch's involvement in Shannon's disappearance, but at the same time, there was not a single direct clue against him. They hoped that a more detailed examination of the young woman's car would bear fruit, but here too, they were out of luck. Because the police did not take fingerprints and look for DNA samples on the first day of the investigation, the experts were not able to find them, but they came to an interesting conclusion. Someone had thoroughly wiped down the car, destroying any potential traces. In an effort to find some hard evidence against Butch, one of the detectives dug up a really interesting fact. He examined the bag containing the Shannon ring and discovered that such items are not manufactured for retail sale. He contacted the manufacturer and learned that the only buyer of such bags in the state of Georgia was Delta Airlines. The company itself stated that the bags were used by mechanics to store small airplane parts, and as we recall, Butch worked as a mechanic for that very company. And that's not all. The detectives went over the whole thing so thoroughly that they found another tiny clue. In Butch's car, they found a piece of the same duct tape in which the pouch had been wrapped. On the tape itself, the experts found microscopic particles of the same metal. After studying its composition, they concluded that this compound is used only in the aviation industry. In spite of all this, the case was frozen for many months. The police and Shannon's parents were sure that Butch was behind the young woman's disappearance, but no one could prove his involvement. All the evidence was circumstantial. As soon as the airline learned of the suspicions about the man, they quickly fired him. Before that, he had managed to brag mockingly to his colleagues that he was a suspect in a case of kidnapping a woman. After reviewing his background, investigators discovered that Butch had quite an impressive criminal history under his belt. They didn't know this at the beginning of the investigation because there was no advanced criminal databases back in the 90s. It turned out that he had committed his first crime when he was still a minor. He got a part-time job and one day went to his boss's house where only his wife was there. Butch tried to tie her up, but he failed. The woman then convinced him that if he left, she wouldn't tell anyone what had happened. He believed her and left the house, and the woman immediately called the police. Butch was arrested, but due to his age, he was only ordered to undergo involuntary psychiatric treatment. This despite the fact that he admitted that he wanted to abuse the woman. The next time he went to the police was for kidnapping a 14-year-old young woman when he was in his 20s and had a wife. He called his younger brother's ex-girlfriend and told her he wanted to meet her. He assured her that his younger brother would be with him, except he came alone to the meeting. Then Butch said that his brother asked him to give her a gift. He asked her to put her hands together, then wrapped a rope around them and took the young woman to his house, where he locked her in the basement. It is unknown how the story might have ended, but Butch's wife accidentally discovered the victim and called the police. The young woman told investigators that Butch molested her, but despite this, he was only sentenced to 4 years in prison. The victim also shared some very disturbing information. Butch told her that if she didn't comply with him, he would do to her what he had done to the previous two, whatever that meant. Released early, less than 2 years later, he remarried. His new wife was unaware of Butch's criminal past. The police believed these were far from all of Butch's crimes. Buried women's clothing indicated that he may have had other victims that he did not leave alive. Shannon's investigators were never able to get any charges against Butch in the case, so they continued to look for any potential evidence, but to no avail. In December 2003, Butch was released early from prison after spending 8.5 years there. In all that time, the police could not come close to charging him with kidnapping Shannon, but they were somewhat lucky. While in prison, Butch frequently hinted to other inmates about his involvement in the case, and many of them agreed to testify against him. Detectives interviewed about 10 inmates. One of them, Adonis Cornwell, said he woke up in the middle of the night to a scream from his cellmate, Butch. He said in tears that he had not killed Shannon. The demons inside him had done it for him. He asked the other inmates what the chances were of going to prison for murder if the victim's body was never found. To one of the inmates, he almost confessed to what he had done. Butch told him that he had left the softball field with Shannon and that the police had been extremely stupid for not examining her car properly. He also said that her body would never be found because it had been scattered in the wind. This testimony, combined with all the previous circumstantial evidence, gave investigators a chance to bring the case to trial. 6 months later, in August 2004, they finally arrested Butch for the first time on charges of kidnapping and murder. According to the investigation, Butch saw Shannon at a gas station and, under some pretext, lured her into his car. Next, he threatened her to drive to his house, or he drove himself. Given that his past known crimes had been committed with knives, it could have been the same in Shannon's case. He then locked her in the house and drove back to the stadium, parking the young woman's car at the gas station. He left the keys in the ignition, wiped off all prints, and left. When he returned home, he could have abused the young woman, killed her, and then disposed of the body. Few people believed the court would convict. I think everyone is familiar with the phrase, "no body, no case," and in the vast majority of cases, it fully reflects reality. It is extremely difficult to prove that a person committed a murder if no one has even seen the victim's body. At the time, there was not a single case in Georgia where a court had convinced a person without a body. But investigators went to great lengths to squeeze the most out of the circumstantial evidence they had. They even brought in prisoners for the trial who had heard hints of Shannon's murder from Butch. He himself insisted on his innocence, and after the trial was over, the jury could not decide on a verdict for 3 whole days. But eventually, they made their decision and found Butch guilty of murder. Consequently, the court sentenced him to life in prison. He was 43 years old at the time, and in theory, he should have spent the rest of his life behind bars. But there was one unpleasant nuance. The perpetrator was eligible to apply for parole every 7 years, according to the statutes in effect at the time of the murder. Butch tried to challenge the court's decision, but he failed, and 2 years later, in 2006, something really unexpected happened. He decided to confess to the murder. His story was almost exactly the same as the prosecution's. He saw Shannon in the parking lot and suggested she go to Burger King for a bite to eat. Shannon agreed, and they drove there in his car. After eating lunch, they drove back to the field, only Butch missed the right turn, stopped the car, and said his leg was cramped. He asked Shannon to drive and got in the back seat. There, he pulled out a prepared knife and threatened to force the young woman to drive to his house. There, he tied her up and told her he wasn't going to hurt her. Butch said he only wanted to sell her car, after which he intended to let her go. She behaved calmly and did not try to scream or fight back. Leaving her tied up in the house, Butch returned to the stadium, drove Shannon's car to the gas station, and left the keys inside. He did this in the hope that someone would steal it, and it would help throw the police off the scent. After thoroughly wiping the steering wheel and other places where he might have left fingerprints, Butch returned home, abused the young woman, and left for the movie theater with his nephews and their parents. Apparently, this family outing he had originally planned as an alibi. When he returned home, he abused Shannon again, while constantly repeating that he would let her go as soon as he sold her car. He then allegedly began to realize the gravity of what he had done and tried to figure out what to do next. He went to bed, but woke up a few hours later and began to panic. Then he went down to Shannon's house, put a tie around her neck, and cut her off. According to Butch, she was asleep at the time, and it all happened very quickly. Next, he spent hours wondering what to do with the body. By morning, he decided to burn it, built a large fire, and added fuel. Putting the body there, he changed his clothes and went to the service at church. When he returned home, the fire had allegedly destroyed all remains. The man said that the unbearable weight of the guilt made him confess to what he had done, but it was hard to believe. First, he made 2 taunting calls to the police and the university, telling them that Shannon was alive while he had already disposed of her body. Second, he planned to kidnap another woman, his wife's best friend, that day. As soon as his wife went out of town, he called her and asked her to come over. Allegedly, he and his wife wanted to meet her, but the friend refused, which saved her life. Knowing this, can we speak of any remorse and guilt on the part of Butch? In addition, he stated that the fire had turned the body to ashes in a matter of hours, which seems impossible. According to the man, when he came home from church, there was no trace of Shannon. He allegedly waited for the ashes to cool, gathered up the ashes, and dumped them on the railroad tracks. Most likely he lied and had to bury the remains, including the bones, somewhere. But why would he do that? The only option here was that Butch realized he might never be released and decided to play the remorse game. But if he had pointed out where the body had been buried, his sentence might have been altered and denied him the opportunity to petition for release. He continued to insist that the fire in his house was really caused by a broken vacuum cleaner, despite the traces of fuel that experts found. As of now, he is still in prison, and his next petition for parole can be filed in 2025, when he will be 64 years old. Shannon's parents continue to fight to ensure that he is never released. The only question that gnaws at investigators to this day is whose belongings were buried in Butch's backyard. Joyce McLean was born on September 4, 1963. When she was young, her family moved to a tiny town called Millmarket, located almost on the edge of the United States. From an early age, she had a passion for music. The girl quickly mastered several instruments, but her favorite was the saxophone. She loved to compose her own compositions and was a member of the school music group. In addition, she was a member of the cheerleading team, played soccer, and in general, was a very active participant in school life. At the end of the summer vacation in 1980, Joyce was preparing for her approaching age of 17. She had only recently received her driver's license, and she planned to go to the lakeshore with her friends and relatives to celebrate her birthday. She was even going to invite a local musical group to celebrate her birthday. Joyce had 2 more grades to finish, after which she planned to go to college. The girl was preparing for this in advance, so she studied only with honors, as well as earning various sports and musical achievements. On August 8th, she and her friends spent the day at the lake, after which she decided to go for a run. Joyce loved sports, but running was not her favorite activity. In spite of that, she was going to play in high school soccer games during the new school year, and she made every effort to keep herself in shape. The girl went out for a run at about 7:30 p.m. Normally, she would run with her friend, but she was busy that night. Joyce had a standard route. She would do a few laps on the road that went around her tiny town. It usually took about an hour, but that night, the girl never made it home. Several hours had passed since Joyce had left, and her mother was beginning to get seriously worried. The girl always let her parents know where she was going, and if she had gone for a walk with friends after her run, her parents would have already known about it. Her mother decided to go looking for her and drove around town in her car. She asked around all the neighbors who came her way, but no one had seen Joyce. Considering the vast majority of the people in this small town knew each other, a few more people joined the search. Night was approaching, and the girl was still nowhere to be found. Then the concerned parents decided to call the police. Local officers immediately joined the search, and in the hours that followed, more and more citizens took to the streets. They combed the route Joyce was running, as well as the area behind the school. Unfortunately, there was no sign of Joyce. With each passing hour, panic increased, and there was little hope of finding Joyce alive and unharmed. It was the middle of the night. The police had completely ruled out the possibility she might have gone out with some friends. The problem was that everyone she knew was at home and later joined the search. Joyce's parents simply couldn't imagine their daughter deciding to go out alone until very late at night. They were unable to locate her, and the search dragged on for 2 days. During that time, police officers, along with residents, continued to explore the area until they finally made the heartbreaking discovery on August 10th. Joyce's body was found just 60 yards from the school playgrounds, not far from the trees. The girl was lying on the ground. Virtually all of her clothes were missing, and her hands were tied behind her back with a piece of blue cloth. The police immediately realized that the victim had been hit hard in the head, but a more detailed analysis was to be done by a medical expert. After examining the body, they concluded that the girl had received multiple blows to the head and that her death occurred on the evening of the same day she disappeared. Despite the almost total lack of clothing, the unknown perpetrator did not abuse her. Unfortunately, no other information could be obtained. There were no foreign DNA samples on the body, and even in the early 1980s, the technology was only in its infancy. The first person in history to be convicted thanks to DNA testing was not arrested until 1987. So the police were forced with a complex investigation with a minimal set of clues. Shortly after the discovery of the body, officers discovered Joyce's clothes, but that did not bring them any closer to a solution either. News of the brutal murder quickly spread through the town, plunging it into a very grim state. As is usually the case, the inhabitants of such tiny towns in the middle of nowhere had never encountered a murder. Adding to the anxiety was the fact that the killer was still out there. His identity remained unknown. Given the complete lack of evidence, several theories swept through the town. The most popular was that Joyce's body had been found near a place where less fortunate youths congregated. They often drank alcohol there at night and also took illegal substances. People thought that a group of such tipsy guys might have molested Joyce and things got out of hand. The police even checked with locals who regularly spent time in those companies, but they were unable to establish their involvement. Another theory was that the killer might have been a man who came for seasonal work. Hundreds of people came to this area on a regular basis since there were not enough local people to fill all the jobs. But even here, the police could not find any evidence. Some even began to suspect the volunteer who discovered Joyce's body. The fact was that he had spent most of his time surveying the area in tandem with another volunteer. On the morning of the last day, however, he went out to search alone. Because of this, there was a theory that he was involved. But even here, the police could not confirm his guilt. There was another version. It turned out that the same night Joyce disappeared, there had been a serious accident not far from the city. A 19-year-old local resident had snuck into a garage and stolen a gas tanker before crashing into another vehicle. He sustained serious head injuries and slipped into a coma for 9 days, making it impossible for the police to question him, and when he woke up, he pleaded not guilty. The investigators didn't know what to do next. They had no evidence or witnesses. As a result, the case went into a long drawer for years, during which time the police were unable to get any closer to a clue. 8 years later, Joyce's relatives created a petition calling for coverage of their daughter's murder on a national unsolved crime show. This would get the word out to viewers across America and draw the attention of potential witnesses. There is always the possibility that someone heard or saw something, but for some reason did not report it to the police. The petition gathered 6,000 signatures, and the authors of the program agreed to do their own story. It was broadcasted in 1989, and the police did indeed receive a lot of appeals, but all of the collected information turned out to be either erroneous or outright false. Unfortunately, this happens in almost every well-known case. People either make mistakes or simply lie and fabricate non-existent facts, forcing the police to waste time and resources on checks. The case stalled for several more years, but all the while Joyce's mother continued to fight for the truth. In the mid-2000s, she decided that new technology and techniques in forensics could help uncover evidence that had been missed in the 1980s. To do so, experts needed to exhume the victim's body, but there were challenges. Initially, authorities denied the mother's request for an exhumation. They believed that in almost 3 decades, any possible evidence simply had not been preserved, but the woman continued to insist. And in 2007, she managed to move the issue from the dead point. The medical expert Peter Cummings of Massachusetts contributed greatly to this effort. He was born in East Millnocket and was only 5 years old at the time of Joyce's murder. Despite such a young age, he remembered well the horror into which his town had been plunged. Peter admitted that it was these events that guided him into the field of forensics and medicine. When he learned that the authorities had rejected Joyce's mother's petition for an exhumation, he contacted her and asked her not to abandon the idea. Peter believed that the remains might have been preserved enough to try to extract evidence from them. He also contacted one of the leading forensic experts in the United States, and he took an interest in the case. Joyce's mother decided to take the initiative and organize an independent examination. The exhumation required about $20,000 for their own funds, which the family did not have, but they had the support of concerned people who, after so many years, still remembered the case. With their help, the family quickly raised the necessary amount, and the exhumation took place in 2008. To the surprise of many, experts did unearth some important evidence, but at the time, they kept this information secret. Investigators only said that the discovery would not be followed by an immediate arrest, but the police immediately reopened the case. A few months later, it was reported that unidentified people had desecrated Joyce's grave. The police said they did not know if it had anything to do with the murder investigation. The next major twist came a year later in 2009, and that moment may have been pivotal as law enforcement announced a prime suspect for the first time in 29 years. Let's take it back to 1980. As we recall, a few hours after Joyce's murder, a local man stole a gasoline truck and got into a serious accident, causing him to fall into a coma. That man was 19-year-old Scott Fournier, and in 2009, he was put on the bench for possession of illegal material with minors. It seemed like the two cases were unrelated, except after the sentencing, the judge suddenly announced Scott as a person of interest in the Joyce McClain murder case, urging the man to confess to what he had done. This news greatly surprised Joyce's relatives. They were well acquainted with Scott and knew that the police were considering him as a suspect because of that accident. But why had a judge officially declared him a person of interest after a long 29 years? The lead detective in the case declined to comment on the situation. He only said that they had made significant progress since the exhumation and that the investigation was well underway. Scott was sentenced to 6.5 years in prison for possession of banned material. It was a minimal sentence despite having a criminal history. He was tried in 1979, 1980, and 1984 for theft, but all of those crimes occurred too long ago to affect the amount of time in the current case. He also came onto the police radar in 2001 when his 6-year-old daughter complained that he was molesting her. Although law enforcement believed the girl, the crime could not be proven, and Scott was not punished. All of the above already seems enough for a man to be seriously considered for the role of Joyce's killer. But as it turns out, that's just the tip of it, and gets much scarier from there. Unfortunately, the case dragged on for several more years while the man was in prison. Investigators kept the evidence they had gathered under wraps and interviewed possible witnesses. In 2015, they assembled a team of 10 men and again surveyed the area where Joyce's body had been found. At the end of the search, they gave no details, but a year later, everything fell into place. On March 4, 2016, police officially announced the arrest of the suspect. Scott Fournier, who had only recently been released from prison, was taken into custody and charged with the murder of Joyce McClain. Scott, who was already 55 years old at the time, refused to plead guilty, and the case went to trial. He spent nearly 2 years in jail awaiting his first hearing because he didn't have $300,000 for bail. The trial didn't begin until 2018, and the public finally learned something really strange. It turned out that Scott had repeatedly confessed to killing Joyce just weeks after the fact. On one occasion, he cried and confessed to his mother and sister that he had killed Joyce. On other occasions, he told a local priest, an acquaintance of a married couple, and a co-worker of his. Some of these confessions did not reach the police until years later, but some became known almost immediately. Scott was questioned, but he began to deny his guilt. The guy referred to the head injury he sustained in the accident. According to him, he really thought he killed Joyce, but now believes that in reality it never happened. He was questioned a total of 27 times, and Scott kept changing his story. At first, he told the police that he killed Joyce by stabbing her several times with a glass insulator from a power line that was lying nearby. The girl was indeed killed right under the power line. Scott further stated that he tied her hands, abused her, and fled. The police were confused by one fact in this story. Firstly, they were unable to identify the exact murder weapon, even though a glass insulator was found near the body. Second, Joyce had not been abused as the medical examiner's report attested, but otherwise his story was very close to the truth. In the following interrogations, he stated that he had killed Joyce in the company of other guys. Then he said he had just watched them attack her. He then changed his statement again and said that these guys forced him to participate in the crime. There were many stories like this, and during the investigation phase, the detectives just got confused. They had no hard evidence against Scott, and his story changed every time they questioned him. For this reason, he was not arrested all these years. It was only in time that they managed to gather enough evidence to bring the case to trial. 2 witnesses helped in this, a priest and a colleague of Scott's who both heard him confess. The colleague asked the guy how he got away with it. Scott replied that he had simply filled the police with false accounts of other people's involvement and that it threw them off the scent. A colleague reported the conversation to his superiors, but not to the police. Apparently, they never passed the information on to law enforcement. He admitted to the priest that he did not abuse Joyce because she was on her period at the time, and that was a key factor. The police never divulged this information, although they became aware of it after examining the girl's body. It turns out that Scott simply could not have known such details unless he himself was the killer. Scott's attorneys insisted that all the evidence was circumstantial. They wrote off their client's confession to the head injuries sustained in the accident. They also cited the fact that the police did not arrest the man immediately after he first confessed to the murder. In addition, the attorneys rebuked the court for refusing to consider other suspects. For example, they tried to pin the blame on the man who discovered Joyce's body, Peter Warley. That morning, he was to go in search of the girl, paired with another volunteer. They had arranged to meet at 6 a.m., but Peter never showed up. Later, the volunteer learned that he had gone out early and found the body. But there's an odd point here, too. This volunteer's sister lived next door to Peter, and on the morning of that day, she saw the man leave the house at dawn. According to the woman, he had a large gym bag in his hands, and when he returned home after finding the body, he looked happy and smiling. This story seems dubious if only for the reason that the volunteer did not report all of this to the police until 16 years after the murder. That already seems strange, and it is impossible to verify the authenticity of his words. Unfortunately, Peter Warley died of a heart attack just 2 days before Scott's arrest. For this reason, no one will ever know why he came out earlier, but the police said that there is no evidence that he was involved in the murder. The prosecution denied all the arguments of the lawyers. They assured him that the police had looked at all possible suspects and had not been able to find even a hint of their involvement. Scott, on the other hand, gave many reasons for suspicion. Even his stepfather told police early in the investigation that he suspected Scott of murder. According to him, a few days before the incident, the boy said he planned to start running in the evenings. He also mentioned that he felt sympathy for Joyce. Moreover, when Scott first confessed to the murder, he was asked to show where he had attacked Joyce. The boy led investigators to the exact spot where the body was found. They cited several other witnesses to corroborate the theory that he was involved. On the evening of Joyce's murder, at about 9 p.m., the couple saw Scott run by the scene of Joyce's murder with a bottle of liquor in his hands. Except, according to them, an unknown young man was running beside him. They didn't know at the time that's where the girl's body would be found, but they later reported it to the police. An hour and a half earlier, 2 local teenagers had also seen Scott and an unidentified young male running through that area. The trial lasted just over 2 weeks, and the final verdict was handed down on February 5, 2018. Scott was found guilty of Joyce's murder, sentencing him to 45 years in prison. At the time, the man was 57 years old, a sentence that virtually guaranteed he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. In 2019, Scott's attorneys appealed, which helped them schedule a new hearing. The court, however, did not change the original sentence. According to the judge, the evidence against the perpetrator was exhaustive, and all the arguments of the defense had no weight. Joyce's relatives lifted from their shoulders the heavy weight of ignorance that had been with them for 38 years. All that time, they had fought for the truth, and it was her mother who contributed the most. This woman dedicated her life to getting justice. Eventually, she went even further and helped pass a law that enabled the authorities to start allocating substantial funds for the creation of unsolved homicide squads. One obscure point remains in the whole story. Who was the other guy seen by witnesses? Scott's involvement here is almost obvious. He knew so many details that the police never disclosed publicly. It just can't be written off as conjecture. But what about the 2 groups of witnesses who told the police the same thing? Could it be that Scott committed this crime in company with some other person? This point is also questionable. After Joyce was killed, Scott stole a gasoline truck and had an accident, but he was the only one in the car. Where did his supposed partner go? Is it possible that they separated immediately after the murder? And yet, the version of the second killer seems dubious.